He slapped the paper against her door so hard, the whole frame shook. Silas Crowell didn't knock, didn't wait, didn't even look at her when she opened it, just pressed that eviction notice flat against the wood with his palm like he was stamping out something unclean, and said, "Sundown. Everything out." Mara stood in the doorway of the only home she'd ever known and felt the cold move through her like water through a crack in stone. If that were you, your home, your name on that paper, your neighbors watching from behind their and not one of them opening their door, what would you do? This is the story of a woman who walked into the mountains with almost nothing and came back as the only reason an entire town survived the worst winter in living memory. Before we go further, if stories like this one find you at the right moment, hit that subscribe button and stay with us to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment reminds me why I keep telling these stories. Now, let's go back to that doorstep. The notice was dated October 28th, 1888, but Silas Crowell didn't deliver it until the morning of the 31st Halloween, and Mara always believed that timing was deliberate. He wanted her scared. He wanted her to feel like something being chased out before dark. She read it twice standing in the cold air with bare feet on the wooden step. The language was formal, dry, full of phrases like outstanding encumbrance and right of possession transferred words designed to make theft sound like paperwork. What it meant, stripped down to its bones, was simple enough. The cabin, the land under it, the woodpile stacked beside it, and the fruit cellar her husband Thomas had dug with his own hands 3 summers ago, all of it now belonged to Coldwater Ridge, First Savings and Loan. Because Thomas was gone, because the harvest had rotted in a wet August, because the debts he'd signed his name to had multiplied the way debts do when a man is desperate and a banker is patient. Crowell stood at the bottom of the porch steps with his coat buttoned to the throat and his hat pulled low, and he watched her read it with the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed a difficult conversation and is relieved to find he doesn't need to have it. The paper said everything. He didn't have to. "You understand what it says?" he asked finally. Mara looked up from the notice. She was 25 years old that morning. She had a broad face that sunburned easily, heavy hands from years of real work. Most of its windows were dark, and dark circles under her eyes that had been there since the letter arrived in September, telling her. Thomas wasn't coming back from the logging camp in accident, they said, though the details were sparse and the condolences were shorter. She wasn't beautiful. In the way Coldwater Ridge seemed to value beauty small, decorative, careful. She was large and solid and real. And she had always understood, with a quiet, exhausting clarity, that the town had already decided what kind of future she deserved. "I understand it," she said. "Good. Sundown, then." He turned and walked back up the dirt road toward town without another word, and Mara stood there holding the note until her fingers went numb from the cold. She didn't cry. That surprised her a little. She'd cried plenty in the weeks after Thomas died, ugly, private crying, the kind you do with your face pressed into a pillow so the neighbors don't hear through the thin walls. She'd cried when she buried the last of the garden vegetables in September and realized the yield was less than half of what they'd needed. She'd cried when the bank's first letter arrived, and the second, and the third, and each one was a little more formal than the last, and a little less interested in her circumstances. But standing on that porch on October 31st, watching Crowell's back disappear up the road, she felt something different. Not grief, not fear exactly. Something colder and quieter, a kind of clarity that comes when there is nothing left to lose. She went back inside. Bruno lifted his big gray and tan head from the floor and watched her with the careful attention of a dog who understands that something is wrong and is waiting to be told what to do about it. "Come on," she said. "We've got work to do." She didn't have much to pack because she hadn't been able to keep much. The things worth taking were practical. The wool blanket she'd made herself from a kit, doubled thick on both ends. Cloth sacks she filled with dried beans 3 pounds, maybe 4. Her flint and steel, wrapped in leather. The tin canteen Thomas had carried during the war. A change of underclothes. The knife her father had given her on the day she left home to marry, which she had always kept sharp more out of principle than expectation. She thought briefly about taking the quilt from the bed, the one with the blue pattern that had been a wedding gift. But it was heavy and damp from the autumn air, and she'd need to move fast. She left it. She took the photograph of Thomas. It was small, the size of a playing card, the edges soft from being handled. He looked younger in it than he'd ever seemed in real life, a boy in a man's coat, squinting a little against the sun. She folded it inside the cloth of the blanket where it wouldn't bend, stood at the door waiting. He was 3 years old, a shepherd mix with one slightly bent ear and a long scar on his left shoulder from a wire fence encountered the previous spring. He was not a beautiful dog. He was, however, extraordinarily loyal in the particular way of animals who have chosen one person and organized their entire existence around that choice. Mara shouldered her bundle. She took one long look at the inside of the cabin, the low ceiling, the window she'd reglazed herself, the iron hook above the fire, where she'd hung herbs to dry all summer. Then she closed the door behind her. She did not look back. The street through Coldwater Ridge was maybe a quarter mile from her cabin to the edge of town, and she walked the whole length of it with Bruno at her heel and her bundle on her shoulder, and not one person came out to speak to her. She saw them, though. Mrs. Haggerty at the dry goods window, pretending to arrange bolts of fabric. The Delaney boys watching from the gap-in barn door. Pastor Clement's wife on the church steps, holding a broom she wasn't using, her mouth pressed into a small, unhappy line that might have meant sympathy or disapproval. With that woman, it was always difficult to tell. Mara walked past all of them without slowing. She understood what their silence meant. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, or not only cruelty. It was something more complicated and more disappointing. It was the calculus that ordinary people make when they are afraid and comfortable at the same time. She is not my problem. And if I make her my problem, I might become a problem too. It was the math of survival dressed up as minding your own business. At the edge of town, old Hector Pruitt, who ran the livery stable and smelled permanently of horse and pipe smoke, stopped sweeping long enough to look at her directly. He was the only one. "Winter's coming fast," he said. It wasn't an offer, but it wasn't nothing either. "I know it," Mara said. He nodded once and went back to sweeping, and she kept walking. The mountains north of Coldwater Ridge were not welcoming mountains. They were the kind of range that looked almost gentle from a distance, dark with pine, softened by distance, and revealed their difficulty only when you were already committed to them. Trails, such as they were, had been made by animals before they'd been made by people, and they had the winding illogic of paths built by creatures that don't care about efficiency, only safety. Mara had walked parts of those trails with Thomas in better years, picking late berries in September, looking for good timber sites, once spending a whole afternoon doing nothing at all except sitting by a creek while Bruno ran back and forth across the rocks. She knew the first 2 miles reasonably well. After that, she was guessing. She didn't let herself think too far ahead. That was a trick she'd learned early in her marriage, when thinking too far ahead meant looking directly at the full shape of what her life might become, and the full shape of it was too much to carry all at once. You take the next step, then the next one. You see what's there. The first day was hard but manageable. She found a shallow depression in the hillside, dry enough, sheltered by a rock overhang, and she and Bruno slept there, with the blanket pulled over both of them, and the cold pressing down from above like a hand. The second day the temperature dropped. The third day it broke open. She heard the blizzard before she saw it, a low pressurized sound moving through the tree line. The kind of sound that isn't wind yet, but is the thing that comes just before wind. Bruno stopped walking and turned his head north, and his ears went flat. "Yeah," Mara said. "I hear it." She had maybe 20 minutes before it hit, and she was in the worst possible position, exposed on a ridge. No real shelter within sight, the light already going gray and strange. She moved as fast as she could through the snow that was already on the ground, keeping low, trying to stay in the tree cover. Bruno moved with her, occasionally outpacing her and then looping back, the way he always did when he was anxious, checking, confirming, checking again. The snow came sideways. Within 10 minutes, she could barely see her own hands. She had stopped thinking about direction and started thinking only about the next 10 seconds. Find something solid. Get lower. Keep moving or the cold wins. Bruno was a dark shape in the white, and she kept one hand on him as much as she could, trusting his navigation when her own failed completely. She didn't know how long they moved like that. Time stops making sense in a whiteout. There is only the cold and the noise in the next 10 seconds. Bruno stopped. She almost walked into him. He was nosing at something low to the ground, a tangle of frozen brush at the base of a rock face that she'd nearly missed entirely in the white. He pushed his muzzle through it and looked back at her. And she understood what that look meant, because she had known this dog for 3 years and trusted him the way she trusted very few people. She got down on her knees and pushed through the brush. The cold changed. Not gone, but different. Less violent. She pushed further, and the wind sound dropped, and she felt something on her face that it took her a full second to identify, because it was so unexpected. Warmth. Not fire warmth. Not the warmth of a building with a hearth. Something older and deeper, a slow, constant heat coming up from the ground itself, like the mountain had been storing it for centuries and was breathing it out now in a long, steady exhale. Mara crawled through the narrow opening and found herself inside. The cavern was enormous. She could sense the size of it before her eyes adjusted, the way sound moved, the way the air circulated. The floor was stone, uneven but dry. The heat was coming from a pool at the far end, dark water with the faint sulfur smell of geothermal springs, steaming gently in the cold air, and the whole space held that warmth like cupped hands around a match. Bruno pressed against her side. His tail moved once, tentative. Mara sat down on the stone floor and put her face in both hands and stayed very still for a long moment. The mountain had given her something that Coldwater Ridge wouldn't. She didn't know yet what she was going to do with it. She didn't know that in 11 weeks, she would be standing at the entrance to this same cavern, watching the same people who had watched her walk out of town, watching them stumble through a blizzard with their children in their arms, and nowhere else. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she was alive, and warm, and the dog was wagging his tail. And right now, that was enough to start with. She didn't sleep that first night so much as she collapsed. There's a difference, though most people have never had occasion to learn it. Sleep is something you choose, something you slide into with a measure of comfort and intention. What Mara did on that stone floor was closer to the body simply shutting itself off, the way a lamp runs out of oil, not gradually, but all at once, the flame there and then not there. She was sitting with her back against the cavern wall. Bruno pressed against her left side, the wool blanket pulled around both of them, and then she was waking up with her neck aching and her mouth dry and the faint smell of sulfur in her nose, and the soft, constant sound of the hot spring moving somewhere in the dark ahead of her. The first thing she did was check that the opening was still there. She needed to know. She hadn't dreamed it, the narrow gap in the frozen brush, the sudden change in temperature, the crawl through stone and cold into something that felt almost like mercy. She moved toward where she remembered the entrance being, found the brush still intact, and pushed her hand through into the outside air. The blizzard had stopped, or paused. With mountain weather, you could rarely tell the difference until several hours had passed, and the sky either cleared or didn't. The air coming through was brutally cold, the kind of cold that has weight to it, that pushes back against your hand. But the wind had settled. She pulled her hand back inside. It was shaking. Bruno appeared at her elbow and pressed the top of his head against her forearm, which was his particular way of saying, "I'm here. What do we do next?" And Mara stood in the gray half-dark of the cavern and made herself breathe slowly and think someone who planned to live through this rather than someone who had just survived the last 12 hours and wasn't sure what came after. The hot spring. That was first. She needed to understand what she had. She moved toward the heat, letting it guide her. It was faint but consistent, radiating from the far end of the cavern the way a banked fire radiates through a closed door, not blazing but steady, reliable in a way that felt almost aggressive given what the outside world was currently doing. The pool itself was roughly circular, maybe 15 feet across, the water dark and slow-moving, steaming quietly into the cavern air. She knelt at the edge and put one hand in, hot, not scalding, but genuinely hot. Hot enough that after 30 seconds, her hand felt better than it had in 3 days. She cupped some water and brought it to her nose. The sulfur smell was there, mineral and faintly eggy, the particular scent of water that has come up from deep underground. She knew enough to be careful with it. She had grown up near a settlement that had a mineral spring, and she remembered her mother saying you didn't drink from them without boiling first. and even then stomachs object. No. But for warmth, for bathing, for keeping the worst of the cold off her body, it was something close to extraordinary. She sat back on her heels and looked at the cavern properly for the first time with enough composure to actually see it. It was large. Larger than she'd registered in the dark and the cold and the shock of arrival. The ceiling was high enough that she couldn't quite make it out. It disappeared into shadow above her. The floor was uneven but solid, stone of varying textures, some areas gritty and rough, others worn smoother in a way that suggested water had moved across them at some point in the distant past. There were natural ledges along the walls at different heights, some wide enough to lie on. The entrance passage was narrow one person at a time, and you had to duck, which meant it was defensible in the most basic sense of the word. One opening. One way in and one way out. Mara sat down on the cavern floor and pulled out the dried beans from her pack and counted them by feel. 4 pounds, roughly. Maybe a little less. She put them back. She was going to have to be very, very careful. The first week taught her things faster than any other week of her life. She learned that the cavern had a secondary air shaft. Somewhere near the ceiling she discovered this when she built her first small fire near the entrance, and the smoke, instead of pooling and choking her, drifted upward and disappeared. She learned this was good and also complicated, because it meant heat escaped the same way smoke, and she'd need to be thoughtful about where she positioned her fires and her sleeping area to retain as much warmth from the spring as possible. She learned that the hot spring maintained a temperature that kept the immediate area around it roughly 20 degrees warmer than the rest of the cavern, and the rest of the cavern was significantly warmer than outside. On the coldest nights, when she lay awake, listening to the mountain groan under the weight of ice and snow, she was cold but not dangerously cold. Her breath misted, her fingers ached, but she was not dying. She learned that snare setting was harder than Thomas had made it look. He'd shown her once, maybe 2 years ago, in that easy offhand way of people who are good at something and don't quite understand why everyone else isn't a quick demonstration with his hands, a couple of sentences of explanation, a shrug. She had not paid sufficient attention. Now she paid attention in the way you only do when failure has real consequences, building her first 3 snares by feel and instinct, and tearing them apart and rebuilding them twice before she got the tension right, placing them along what she hoped were animal trails in the snow outside the cavern entrance. The first 2 caught nothing. The third, on the 5th day, caught a snowshoe hare. It was the most significant meal of her life. She sat inside the cavern entrance with the hare in her hands and felt something that wasn't quite pride, but was adjacent to it, the satisfaction of a problem solved through effort rather than luck. She cooked it over the small fire and ate every part of it she could use, and boiled the bones for broth and saved the skin, because waste was no longer something she could afford, even theoretically. Bruno watched her through all of this with great attention, and received a portion that was probably larger than was strictly practical. She didn't apologize for that. Coldwater Ridge, meanwhile, was beginning to understand what kind of winter it had walked into. Mara didn't know this yet. She had no way of knowing. She was cut off from the town as completely as if it had never existed, and on most days she was too occupied with the immediate problems of staying alive to spend much energy thinking about what she'd left behind. But the winter that was working on her was working on everyone, and it had no interest in being fair about it. The snow that year had a particular character, not a single devastating fall, but a relentless accumulation, week after week, that piled up faster than it could be cleared, and settled, with a weight that cracked roofs and bent fence lines, and buried the railroad tracks so thoroughly that the supply trains stopped running in the second week of November and did not run again for months. Cold that came with it was the old, serious kind, the kind that killed livestock overnight and froze well solid, and turned any exposed skin to dead white in under 10 minutes. The town was not prepared. Towns rarely are for the worst version of something, because preparing for the worst version means accepting it might actually happen, and most people would rather not. Firewood, which had seemed adequate in October, began running low by early December. Food stores that should have lasted through March started getting supplemented with rationing in January. Illness moved through the settlement the way it always does when people are crowded and cold and not eating enough quietly at first. A cough here, A fever there, and then not quietly at all. None of this reached Mara in her mountain. What each reached her instead, on a gray Thursday morning in the second week of December, was a man. She heard him before she saw him, the particular noise of someone moving through deep snow who doesn't know the terrain and is too cold to be careful about it. A crashing, stumbling progress through the brush outside the cavern entrance. Bruno heard it too and was on his feet immediately, hackles up, a low sound in his chest that wasn't quite a growl but was the thing just before one. Easy, Mara said quietly. She had the knife in her hand. Not raised, just in her hand. The brush at the entrance shook, and a man fell through it onto the cavern floor like a tree coming down. He was big, broad across the shoulders, dressed in layers of fur and wool that had done him limited good given how thoroughly soaked and frozen he appeared to be. He had a beard that was half ice. He lay face down on the stone floor for a moment without moving, and then he lifted his head and looked at her, and his eyes were the blank, unfocused eyes of someone who has been cold for long enough that their brain has started economizing. "There's a woman," he said. His voice was thick, slurred. I thought I was... "You're in out of the cold," Mara said. "Stay where you are. Don't try to stand up fast." She kept the knife where it was and studied him. He was somewhere in his 40s, with the particular weathered quality of a man who spends most of his time outdoors, deep lines around his eyes, hands that were cracked and calloused even before the cold damage. His pack, which had fallen half off him when he came through the entrance, contained trapping equipment, a trapper, lost in the whiteout, following the heat signature, the steam rising through cracks in the rock above without knowing what it meant. "Can you feel your feet?" she asked. He thought about this. Some of them. Not the right answer. She moved toward him, keeping the knife low and visible, not threatening, just present. "Take your boots off. Both of them. Do it now while you can still use your hands." He looked at her like she'd said something complicated. Your feet are frostbitten, or they're about to be. The boots need to come off now, not in an hour. Do you understand me?" He understood her. His name she found out, over the next hour, as she worked on warming him up, moving him closer to the spring, forcing him to drink boiled water, checking his feet for the waxy discoloration that meant tissue death, was Gideon Pike. He'd been trapping the upper ridgelines for 3 weeks and had misjudged the weather window, which he admitted with the particular self-disgust of a man who has who has made a professional error and knows it. "I've been out and worse," he said. He was sitting with both feet near the edge of the hot spring, his socks off, his expression caught somewhere between relief and humiliation. Evidently not. The steam. He looked up at the ceiling toward where the heat escaped. "I saw it coming up through the snow. Thought maybe a fire. But it wasn't moving right for a fire." He looked around the cavern properly for the first time, and she watched his face change as he started to comprehend the size of it, the steadiness of the heat, the pool itself. How did you find this?" "My dog found it." Bruno, from his position near the entrance, did not react to this acknowledgement. He was watching Gideon with the steady, evaluating attention he gave all strangers, which was more patient than suspicious, but not entirely without edge. "How long have you been here?" 6 weeks. Gideon stared at her. 6 weeks. With the dog. He was quiet for a moment. "People in town said you went up the mountain." His voice was careful now. "In October. People in town were correct. They thought..." He stopped. "I know what they thought," Mara said. She was stirring the beans she'd set to boil earlier, not looking at him. "They were wrong. That happens sometimes." He was quiet again for longer this time. She let the silence sit. She'd gotten comfortable with silence over the past 6 weeks. In a way she hadn't expected, it had stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like a material she could work with, that she could shape around things she didn't need to say out loud. "Your feet have some cold damage," she said finally. "Not the worst kind. You'll keep your toes if you're careful." She glanced up. "You need to stay off them for at least 2 days. Possibly 3. He opened his mouth. "I'm not asking," she said. He closed his mouth. He had the look of a man recalibrating his understanding of the current situation, sorting out who was in charge of what. It took him perhaps 15 seconds. Then he nodded once, and she could see him making a kind of peace with it. Stayed 4 days. On the first day, he slept most of the time, which was his body catching up on what it needed. On the second day, he woke up properly and ate what she gave him and started paying attention. On the third day, he began helping carefully on recovering feet with the tasks she'd established: water collection, fire maintenance, checking the snares. He was good with the snares in the way she was not yet, adjusting her setups with a few small changes that she observed carefully and filed away. They didn't talk much. What conversation they had was practical, the kind of talk that happens between people who are focused on the same problems and don't have energy left over for anything decorative. She told him what she'd figured out about the cavern. He told her what he knew about the surrounding terrain, the animal trails, the areas most likely to offer consistent trapping. It was the most useful conversation she'd had in months, and she felt the specific pleasure of information exchanged between two people who both have something the other needs. On the third night, he said, without preamble, "You've got this place organized better than any camp I've ever wintered in." She looked up from the mending she was doing. "I had time to figure it out. Coldwater Ridge doesn't know what it's got," he said, "what it threw away." She set down the mending and looked at him directly. He was sitting across the fire with his hands around a tin cup, looking into the coals, and he had the expression of a man saying something he'd been thinking about for a while. "Coldwater Ridge didn't throw anything away," she said. "They just didn't pick it up." Gideon looked at her. "Is there a difference?" She thought about it. "Maybe not. But one of them's something I did wrong, and the other one isn't." He nodded it slowly. He looked back at the fire. After a moment, he said, "Crowell made out like he was doing the town a service, clearing a bad debt off the books. People let him because it's easier to let him. I know. He's got the mayor convinced, too. Voss follows wherever the money points." Mara said nothing. She picked up the mending again. There was something tightening in her chest that she recognized as the particular anger she'd been carrying since October, not hot, not explosive, but slow burning and specific, the kind of anger that is actually a form of grief underneath, if you press on it hard enough. She'd learned to keep it where it belonged, which was behind everything else, motivating without consuming. "What are you going to do?" Gideon asked. "When spring comes." "I don't know yet," she said. It was the truth. She'd stopped thinking past the next week because the next week was enough. "You could come back to town." She looked up again. "Not saying it's fair," he said quickly, "just saying it's an option." On whose terms? He had no answer for that, and she hadn't expected one. He left on the morning of the 5th day, when the weather opened briefly and she insisted he go. She sent him one portion of the hare she'd caught 2 days earlier, wrapped in cloth, and directions back to the lower trail that would take him to Coldwater Ridge in half a day's snow held. At the entrance, he stopped and turned back. "I'll tell them," he said. She understood what he meant. "You'll tell them what? What you did. What you've got here." She stood in the entrance with Bruno beside her and felt the cold air coming through, and she thought about Silas Krell reading a notice against her door. She thought about Mrs. Haggerty at the dry goods window. She thought about the long walk out of town with not one door opening. "Tell them whatever you want," she said. "It's true." He nodded. He turned and pushed through the brush into the white outside world, and she listened to his footsteps fade, and then there was only the mountain and the dog and the steady sound of the spring. She didn't know what she expected Gideon's story to do when it reached Coldwater Ridge. She told herself she didn't care, which was partially true and partially the kind of thing you tell yourself when you're not sure you can afford to care. What actually happened was this. Gideon Pike walked back into Coldwater Ridge on a Thursday afternoon, looking like a man who'd come back from somewhere significant, which he had, and he stood in the livery stable, where old Hector Pruitt and 2 other men were trying to repair a water pump that had frozen solid, and he told them what he'd found. He told it straight, without embellishment, in the flat factual way of a man reporting on terrain, because that's how he thought of it, and because, in his experience, plain facts hit harder than decoration. He described the cavern. He described the hot spring. He described the snares and the organization and the food rationing and the young woman who had been living alone in a mountain for 6 weeks and had pulled him out of hypothermia on a stone floor without making a particular fuss about it. The men in the livery listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a silence that had a specific weight to it. "Mara Ellsworth," Hector Pruitt said. "Not a question." "That's right." Another silence. Then one of the other men, whose name was Aldrich, and who ran the feed store, said, "Well?" He didn't say anything after that for a moment. Then, "Well, I'll be." The story moved through Coldwater Ridge the way significant information moves through a small town, not all at once but in waves, person by person, each retelling slightly shaped by the person doing the telling and the person doing the listening, accumulating texture with each pass. By the end of the first day, most of the town knew a version of it. The version that reached Mayor Harlan Voss was filtered through 2 or 3 intermediaries and had gained some color in transit. The cavern had become somewhat more dramatic, spring somewhat more miraculous, but the essential facts were intact. And Voss was smart enough to hear the essential facts underneath the drama. A large, warm, sheltered space, heated naturally, already established and functioning, maintained by one person with a working knowledge of it. His first instinct was political. How does this help me? His second instinct was logistical. The food supply was becoming a genuine problem. The illness in the settlement was spreading. The railroad wasn't coming back before spring. His third instinct, which arrived a little behind the others but pushed past them once it got there, was simple and cold and had nothing to do with Mara at all. He went to see Crowell. Silas Crowell's office was the warmest room in Coldwater Ridge, which in the current winter was a meaningful distinction. He kept a fire going that most of the town couldn't afford to match, and he sat behind his desk with the particular composure of a man who has organized his life so that external difficulty becomes other people's problem. He listened to Voss's account of Gideon's story with no expression on his face, and then he was quiet for a long moment. And then he said, "How large is the cavern?" "Large," Gideon said. "I mean, how many people?" Voss looked at him. "As shelter, as anything. That kind of space, heated year-round, that size, that's not just shelter, property." Crowell leaned back in his chair. "And I'd like to know who holds the title to the mountain acreage." This was the sentence that would circle back to Mara eventually. It always does, the small, precise moment when someone decides to take what isn't theirs. "She's up there living in it," Voss said slowly. "She's up there squatting on bank-adjacent land," Crowell said. "There's a difference." He picked up his pen, looked at it, set it down again. "I'll need to look at the survey maps." Mara knew none of this. She was aware that Gideon had probably told people something, and she'd made a rough calculation that the something he told them was likely to cause ripples. But she had no framework for predicting exactly what kind, and she had more immediate concerns. The beans were running lower than she liked. She had supplemented them with what the snares produced hair, mostly, once a grouse that had apparently decided the brush near the cavern entrance was a reasonable winter shelter, which suggested the grouse had worse judgment than Bruno, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. She'd been managing her daily intake with a precision that felt simply responsible in this one. Insensely eating and less than she wanted every single day for 6 weeks, making the arithmetic work. She was also tired in a way that ran deeper than sleep could fix. Not broken, she was careful to distinguish between tired and broken, carrying a weight that was more than physical. Some days, the silence of the cavern pressed on her differently, less like comfortable solitude and more like the specific loneliness of someone who has been cut off from ordinary human contact for too long. She missed conversation that wasn't about survival. She missed the sound of other people's problems for once instead of only her own. She missed, if she was honest, the small meaningless social textures of life. In even a limited community, the nod from a neighbor, the brief exchange at a well, the simple confirmation that other people existed, and she was one of them. She didn't miss Coldwater Ridge, but she missed the idea of it, the version of it that should have existed, the one where someone had opened a door. She was thinking of sitting by the spring in the late afternoon. She calculated was roughly the 3rd week of December, when Bruno's ears came up and he turned toward the entrance. Footsteps. More than one person. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, knife in hand, moving to a position that put the fire between her and the entrance. The brush shook. A head came through, then shoulders a man she didn't recognize. Heavyset, dressed in the good coat of someone who didn't usually have reason to be in the mountains. Behind him, another figure, and behind that one, the familiar shape of Mayor Harlan Voss, who stood of its windows inside the cavern entrance and looked around with the particular expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. The first man Mara would learn was Crowell's surveyor. Voss saw her and had the decency to look uncomfortable. Mrs. Ellsworth, he said. Mayor, she did not move. She did not lower the knife either. You've come a long way in bad weather. We have. He looked around the cavern again, and she could see him revising whatever Gideon's account had given him to picture. The reality was bigger. She could see him calculating what bigger meant. Quite something. Yes, she said. It is. We'd like to talk about— I know what you'd like to talk about, Mara said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. I heard what Silas Crowell said about the survey maps. Voss went very still. Who told you? Nobody told me. I know how that man thinks. She looked at the surveyor, who had the good sense to be studying his shoes. Whatever he sent you to find, you won't find it. This land doesn't belong to the bank. It's never belonged to the bank. There are no liens here, no deeds, nothing that has Crowell's name or the bank's name on it. You're welcome to check, Mrs. Ellsworth. I'm not finished. Her hands were entirely steady, which was not how they felt on the inside, but she'd learned a long time ago that what your hands look like matters more than what they feel like. I've been here 6 weeks. I've kept myself alive in conditions that most people in that town would not survive. And I've done it alone, on this land that no one had any claim on until the moment Gideon Pike came back and told people it existed. And now suddenly there's a question about titles and surveys. She looked at Voss directly. I want you to think carefully about what that looks like. Voss did think about it. She could see him thinking about it, the practical man behind the political one, doing the actual calculation. The most of its windows were dark, the one that counted votes and community memory and the specific weight that gignaled and scared in a town that was cold and paying attention to who could actually keep them alive. Crowell isn't here, Voss said finally. I came to talk, not to survey. Then say what you actually came to say. He took a breath. The town is struggling, is worse than anyone planned. The railroad is stopped. The food stores are getting thin, and there are families with young children who are— He paused, chose his word carefully. Vulnerable. Mara waited. This place, he said, gesturing at the cavern around them, could help people. Yes, she said. It could. We'd like to discuss an arrangement. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the walk out of town in October, the faces behind the windows, the broom Mrs. Clement had been holding like a prop, old Hector Pruitt and his brief, insufficient acknowledgement. An arrangement, she repeated. Mrs. Ellsworth, I haven't said no, she said. I'm just making sure we both understand what we're actually talking about. You want to use my sanctuary, the sanctuary I found and built and maintained while your town watched me walk away with a blanket and a sack of beans. She let that land. What exactly is Coldwater Ridge offering in return? Voss opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I thought so, Mara said, not unkindly. You haven't gotten that far yet. He had the grace to look abashed. Come back when you have, she said, and come back without the surveyor. She cooked them both something hot before they left, because despite everything she was not able to watch cold, uncomfortable people refused to be fed. It was a failing, possibly that her instinct toward basic care was stronger than her instinct toward justified withholding. Or maybe it wasn't a failing at all. Maybe it was just who she was. The surveyor ate without looking at her. Voss ate and looked at her the whole time with the complicated expression of a man who is being forced to update his understanding of something he thought he'd already figured out. When they were done, she showed them out. She stood at the entrance and watched them disappear into the white mountain, and then she turned back to the cavern, the warmth of it, the steady dark water of the spring, Bruno watching her from his spot near the fire, and she felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not victory. Nothing had been won yet. Not peace, there was too much unresolved for peace. Something more like standing, the specific confidence of someone who knows exactly where they are and what the ground beneath them can hold. She went back inside. There were snares to check in the morning, and beans to count, and wood to stack, and the long winter was nowhere near finished with any of them yet. Voss came back 4 days later, without the surveyor. He came alone this time, which Mara respected, and he came on foot through knee-deep snow, which she respected more, because a man who sends someone else to do his difficult errands is one kind of man, and a man who shows up himself in bad weather is another kind entirely. She wasn't prepared to like him. She wasn't sure she was ever going to like Harlan Voss, but she could recognize the difference. Bruno heard him coming from a distance, and this time didn't raise his hackles, which was its own form of assessment. Dogs remember people their owner fed. Bruno had eaten well the afternoon Voss visited, and apparently had filed that information under not immediately dangerous. Mara was at the entrance when he came through the brush, snow-crusted and breathing hard from the climb. He straightened up and took his hat off and held it in both hands the way men do when they've come to say something uncomfortable and want to signal in advance that they know it. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started. Assumed. She moved back toward the fire. "Come in. Sit down." He sat on the flat ledge she'd designated as the closest thing the cavern had to a chair, and he held his hat in his lap and looked at the spring, and then at the ceiling, and then at her, and she let him take his time, because whatever he was about to offer was going to shape the next part of her life, and she didn't want him rushing through it. "Crowell looked at the survey maps," he said, "like you figured he would, and you were right. The mountain acreage isn't any of the bank's holdings. It's unregistered land. Nobody owns it, which means nobody can take it," Mara said. Voss turned his hat in his hands. "It also means you don't own it. Not legally. I know that. I'm not threatening. I'm just laying out the situation plainly." She looked at him steadily. "Then lay it out." He did. What Coldwater Ridge was prepared to offer was this: access to the cavern as a community resource if it became necessary, meaning if the winter got worse, meaning if people were in danger, in exchange for the town's formal support of Mara's claim to the land when spring came and legal filings could be made. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a guarantee. But it was the mayor's word in front of witnesses, written down, that Coldwater Ridge would stand behind her claim and not contest it. Marcia listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "What does Crowell think of this arrangement?" Voss's jaw tightened slightly. "Crowell has thoughts about a lot of things. That isn't an answer. Crowell doesn't run the town council." He paused. "He influences it, but he doesn't run it. Not anymore, if the winter keeps going the way it's going." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "People are scared, Mrs. Ellsworth. The kind of scared where they start paying attention to who's actually helping them and who's just got money." Mara was quiet for a long moment. She was doing the calculation not quickly, not graciously, but honestly. She'd been honest with herself her entire life, sometimes to a degree that wasn't comfortable, and she wasn't going to stop now. The offer was real, as far as she could tell. Voss wasn't a man she'd call trustworthy in the way that Gideon was trustworthy. He was a politician, which meant his reliability was conditional on his self-interest. But right now her self-interest and his were pointed in the same direction, and that was its own kind of alignment. And there was another thing she didn't let herself ignore: the winter wasn't done. But she'd been here long enough to feel the mountain's rhythms, the way the cold came in waves with brief, deceptive openings between them, and what she felt in the past week suggested the worst was still ahead. If Coldwater Ridge's most vulnerable people were in real danger, her being in a position to help them mattered more than the satisfaction of making Voss wait. That was a hard thing to know about herself. But she knew it. "All right," she said. He blinked. He'd apparently expected more negotiation. "All right," she repeated. "If people are in genuine danger, children, the elderly, people who can't survive the cold where they are, I'll open the cavern. I'm not putting it in anyone's hands but mine. I set the terms inside this mountain, but I'll open it." He stopped. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." She looked at him with the clear, level gaze she'd developed over 2 months of having no one to perform anything for. "If Crowell makes any move toward this land before the spring filings are done, the agreement is off. Completely. And I want that understood before you walk back down. Understood. And Gideon Pike should be part of any conversation about the land claim. He found this place. His account is what made it real to your town." She paused. "He deserves to be in the room." Voss nodded. "I can do that. Then we understand each other." He left an hour later, moving faster on the way down than he'd come up, the way people do when a hard errand has been completed. Mara stood at the entrance and watched, and then she turned back inside, and Bruno was sitting in the middle of the cavern floor, looking at her, with his head tilted slightly to one side. "I know," she said. "I know." She wasn't sure she'd done the right thing. She wasn't sure she'd done the wrong thing either. She'd done the only thing she could do while still being the person she actually was. Which was sometimes the most you could say about any decision. The next storm announced itself the way the worst ones always did, not with drama, but with a specific quality of quiet. The air stopped moving. The temperature, which had been fluctuating for days, dropped suddenly, subtly settled at a dropping, and simply settled at a number that had no interest in going anywhere. Sky went the color of old pewter and stayed that color for 2 full days. Mara felt it in her joints first, which was new. She was 25, too young for her joints to be a weather instrument, but the mountain had done things to her body over these months that she hadn't fully cataloged yet. She felt it in the way Bruno stopped going near the entrance without prompting, curling instead near the spring with his chin on his paws, watching the tunnel with the resignation of a creature that has learned. There are some situations where waiting is the only reasonable response. On the morning of the 3rd day, the snow started. By midday, it was a whiteout. By the following morning, it was something worse than that. She had never heard snow have sound before, not real sound, not like this. It was pressing against the mountain above her, and the mountain was transmitting it downward. A low, continuous vibration that wasn't quite noise, but wasn't quite not. She sat by the spring, with her knees pulled up, and listened to it, and understood for the first time in a visceral, body-level way what this storm meant for anyone who was still in Coldwater Ridge, in a house with thin walls and a firewood supply that had been running short for weeks. She thought about the children Voss had mentioned. She hadn't asked how many. She should have asked how many. She thought about Mrs. Haggerty at the dry goods window. An old woman, probably cold in a room above her shop, with whatever firewood she'd managed to put by in the autumn when nobody had known yet that this winter was going to be what it was. Thought about the church, which was the largest building in town and would probably be where people gathered if things got bad enough. She thought about Pastor Clement's wife with her broom on the steps, not warmly, but she thought about her. You could dislike someone and still not want them to freeze. The tunnel of her thinking kept coming back to the children. She checked her snares twice that day, which was more than she needed to. She kept moving because sitting still in that particular quality of silence made her mind run in directions she didn't want it to run. They came on the 4th day of the storm. She heard them, before she saw the light of their torches through the brush, a sound that wasn't one person but many, a collective noise of movement and distress that was different in character from anything she'd heard in 2 months of mountain solitude. Bruno was on his feet, and at the entrance before she reached it, and this time his tail was moving not happily, not the tail wag of greeting, but the quick, anxious movement that meant many things are happening at once, and I am not sure how to categorize them. Mara got to the entrance just as the first torch came through the brush. It was Gideon Pike, and his face above the torchlight was tight with cold, and something that looked like relief so acute it was almost pain. Behind him was a woman she recognized as Aldrich's wife, carrying a child on her back and pulling another by the hand. Behind her, more people. She couldn't count them yet. They were still emerging from the white, stumbling through the snow toward the opening, and there were more behind them than she could see. How many? She said immediately. 37. Gideon's voice was rough. Maybe 40 by the time the last group gets here. Voss sent the word 2 hours ago. The Henderson house roof collapsed. Cold got into the Morrison family bad. 3 of the kids are. He stopped. It got bad fast. The Morrison children. How bad? Fever. Shaking. They were in a room with no fire by the time we got to them. Mara stepped back from the entrance. Bring them in first. The sick children and their family first, right next to the spring. Everyone else tell them to move toward the back wall and stay together for warmth. Not near the entrance, not near the fires I have going. Those are for heat management. Tell them. She looked at him steadily. Tell them I'm in charge in here, Gideon. Not Voss, not anyone else. If that's a problem for anyone, now is the time to say so. He held her gaze for 1 second. Then he turned back to the crowd and raised his voice. She didn't hear what he said because she was already moving, going to the spring, testing the water temperature, calculating what she had and what she needed and what she could improvise in the time available. So Morrison children need a warming, and they needed it done correctly, not too fast, because rapid rewarming of hypothermic patients caused its own damage if you didn't know what you were doing. She knew this the way she knew the snare technique now imperfectly, through reading and listening and thinking and hard about things before she needed them, but rather than formal training, but knowing more than nothing, which was what mattered right now. People started coming through the entrance in a stream. She had imagined this moment in the abstract since Voss's second visit, but imagining it and living it were categorically different. In the imagined version, she'd been composed, efficient, prepared. In the real version, there were 37 people moving into a space she'd organized for one, and the organization she'd spent 2 months building was being unmade in real time, and there was a child being carried in with gray lips and a woman behind her who was crying in the high air with someone who is holding it in for too long and can't anymore. Mara went to the child first. Her name, she found out later, was Clara Morrison, 6 years old, the youngest of 3. She was wrapped in everything her mother had been able to put on her in a hurry, but the layers were wet from the journey through the snow, and wet layers are worse than no layers, which most people don't know until they learn it the hard way. Most of its windows were dark. Mara started peeling the wet things off, which made the mother a woman named Ruth, who was simultaneously trying to manage the other 2 children and losing the battle with her own composure, grab her arm. "Don't she'll freeze? The wet clothes are making it worse," Mara said. She kept her voice even and certain, because certain was what Ruth Morrison needed right now, not discussion. Dry clothes. Dry and warm. That's what she needs. "Do you have anything dry in what you brought?" Ruth stared at her for a moment with the blank, overwhelmed look of someone whose brain is running several emergencies at once. Then she nodded and started going through her bundle with shaking hands. "Good." Mara kept working. "What are the other 2 children's names?" Ruth told her. Mara repeated the names back to her, not because she needed to, but because she'd learned that parents in distress need to hear their children acknowledged as specific people, not just problems to be managed. It helped Ruth's hands stop shaking. Small things sometimes do. The next 4 hours were the hardest she had ever worked. Not physically, though it was physical, definitely physical. Moving between groups of people, hauling water, managing fires, directing where people sat and lay, making constant assessments she had no formal training for and no backup on. Most of its windows were dark, but the hardest part was the mental weight of being the only person in the cavern who actually knew what the cavern could and couldn't do. Everyone else was operating on fear and cold and relief makes people careless in its own particular way. They sit too close to fires. They drink water too fast on empty stomachs. They assume that being inside means being safe and stop paying attention to the smaller details that determine whether inside actually stays safe. Kept moving. She kept correcting. She kept her voice at a level that was firm without being sharp, because sharp made people defensive, and defensive people stopped cooperating, and she needed cooperation more than she needed to express how tired she was. Gideon worked alongside her without being asked, reading what she needed and doing it before she had to say it, and she felt a gratitude for him that was too large to articulate right then. Mayor Voss arrived in the 2nd hour with the last group of evacuees. He came through the entrance with snow caked on his coat and found Mara directing 3 men on where to place makeshift bedding, and he stood there for a moment, taking in what the cavern had become, the organized chaos of it, the way people were moving in the patterns she'd established, the fires correctly positioned, the sick children near the spring already with more color in their faces than they'd had when they arrived. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a precise name for. Not quite wonder, not quite shame. Something that sat between them and had elements of both. "Tell me what you need," he said. It was the right thing to say. She noted it. More hands on water. The spring water needs to be boiled before anyone drinks it. There are 3 pots. Keep them going. Don't let anyone drink directly from the pool. She didn't stop moving while she's talked to him. Anyone with wet clothing needs to get the wet things off. There are dry areas on the upper ledges where things can be laid to dry near the heat. I need someone managing that rotation so nothing gets left up there. And I need people to stop moving around unnecessarily, because every time someone moves they cool down and then they need more warmth, and we have limited resources for that. Voss was already turning to organize the people nearest him. "And keep Crowell away from the spring," she added. He stopped. "He'll want to look at it," she said. "He'll want to talk about it. This is not the time for that conversation." Voss looked at her for a beat. "Thank you." He moved off, and Mara went back to what she'd been doing, which was checking on Clara Morrison, who was warmer now and had opened her eyes and was looking at the cavern ceiling, with the slightly dazed expression of a child who is not sure if what she is seeing is real. "Are we inside the mountain?" Clara asked. "We are," Mara said. "Is it magic?" Mara thought about the hot spring, about the way she'd found it crawling through frozen brush in a blizzard with her hands going numb, about the 6 weeks she'd spent turning a geological accident into something a human being could survive in. "Not exactly," she said, "but it's pretty good." Clara appeared to find this satisfactory. She closed her eyes again. Silas Crowell arrived in the 4th hour. She'd known he would. Of course he would when the most important thing in the county is a warm mountain cavern, and Silas Crowell is cold and uncomfortable. There was never any realistic chance he was going to stay in his office with his dying fire and his survey maps and let everyone else survive without him. He came through the entrance like a man who was pretending to arrive, somewhere he had a right to be, with 2 men from the bank behind him, and he looked around the cavern with the scanning, assessing look of someone pricing things. Mara watched him from across the space. She was near the far wall, helping an elderly man named Beaumont get his coat off before the retained wet became a problem, and she watched Crowell take in the cavern, the spring, the people, the organization, and she watched his face go through several calculations that she could read quite clearly from 20 feet away. He hadn't expected this. The version in his head had probably been simpler: a frightened woman, a fortunate accident of geology, something that could be reasoned about in the language of deeds and title claims. The reality was something else. The reality was dozens of his neighbors and their children alive and warming up under the management of the woman he'd put a notice on in October. He moved toward the spring. Gideon stepped in front of him, not aggressively, just present, the way a large man can be present in a way that makes a path less clear. "Gideon," Crowell said. "Silas." Gideon's voice was pleasant. "Mrs. Ellsworth asks that people stay clear of the spring unless they've got a task there. Water management." "I'd like to have a look at—" "I know," Gideon said, "but not right now." They looked at each other. Crowell was a man accustomed to his preferences being treated as instructions, and the particular friction of encountering someone who was not going to do that registered on his face. He turned to look for Voss. Voss was on the other side of the cavern and made no move to come to him. Crowell turned back. He looked past Gideon to where the hot spring was slowly heating 37 cold people through the medium of the air above it, doing what it had always done, simple and geological and indifferent to human claims of ownership. "Fine," he said. It didn't sound fine, but he said it. He found a place against the wall and sat down, and Mara, from across the cavern, allowed herself one brief moment of something that felt like satisfaction before she went back to work. They were there for 11 days. Later, when she had the distance to think about it, she would say those were the strangest 11 days of her life. Stranger even than the first weeks alone in the mountain, because at least then, the situation had been simple. Now the situation was 37 people, then 41, then 44 as the last of the evacuated families arrived in a space she'd designed for one, for a period of time that extended well past the initial emergency and settled into something that had to be managed as a longer-term reality. The first 2 days were pure survival mode. After that, once people were warm and dry and had eaten something, and the sick children had turned the corner away from the worst of it, the real challenge began: keeping a community of 44 people organized and functional in a mountain cavern with limited food, limited space, and the highly variable psychological states of individuals who had just left everything they owned behind in an emergency. Mara had not run a community before. She had not run anything before her life. Before Thomas died had been the life of a farmer's wife, which involved immense amounts of work but little that anyone would call authority. She learned by doing, and she made mistakes, and she corrected them as quickly as she could without spending energy on self-reproach, because self-reproach was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. What she was good at, she discovered, was seeing what needed doing and identifying who was best positioned to do it. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires a kind of clear-eyed assessment of people that is distinct from either liking them or judging them. You have to see what they're actually capable of, not what you wish they were capable of, and not what they've previously done or failed to do. She put Aldrich in charge of the food ration because he was a feed store man and understood inventory management. She put Ruth Morrison once Clara and the other children were stable in charge of the sick area, because Ruth had a precision about her when she was focused that Mara recognized as useful. She put Gideon in charge of the outside scouting and snare management, which freed her up to manage the interior. She put Crowell in charge of nothing, which was itself a message he received quite clearly. He came to her on the third day. She was at the fire when she heard him coming, and she knew it was him before she turned around, at a particular way of clearing his throat before he spoke to someone, a preparatory noise that functions both announcement, assertion. Mrs. Ellsworth. She turned. He was holding a tin cup of hot water, the communal supply, same as everyone else, and he looked older than he had on her doorstep in October. Confidence that came from being warm and fed and powerful was a particular kind of confidence, and its absence left a different face underneath. Crowell. He looked at the cup in his hand. He stopped. He tried again. The terms I gave you in October, the notice. He looked up, and she could see it's costing him something to hold her gaze. It was within the bank's legal authority. She waited. That doesn't mean it was. He stopped again. He seemed to be searching for a word that was simultaneously true and bearable to say. Right? She offered. He was quiet for a moment. I was going to say necessary. It wasn't an apology. She'd known it wouldn't be. Men like Crowell didn't apologize. They revised. They recontextualized. They found language that preserved the essential architecture of their self-image, while acknowledging that something had perhaps been suboptimal. She could be disappointed by this, or she could accept it for what it was. You're welcome here the same as everyone else, she said. That's all I've got to say about October. He nodded. He started to turn away. Crowell. He stopped. The water by the east wall needs rotating to the fire. Pot on the left has been sitting too long and it'll go cold. She looked at him steadily. Closest. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. He went and moved the pot. She watched him do it, a wealthy man in a good coat doing basic camp maintenance in her mountain, and she didn't feel what she might have expected to feel. Not triumph. Not the gratifying reversal of fortune that the situation might seem to demand. She felt tired, mostly. And something else, something quieter, the awareness that keeping this man alive and warm, keeping all of them alive and warm, was the same work regardless of who they were or what they'd done, and the work was just the work, and she was going to do it. The children were the thing that shifted everything. Not in a single moment it wasn't like that. It was gradual, the way most significant changes are, a slow reorientation of the social geography of the cavern over the 11 days they were there. Children, in a crisis, do not maintain the same social distances that adults do. They don't carry the history. Clara Morrison, by the 4th day of her recovery, was following Mara around the cavern with the focused attention of a 6-year-old who has decided that someone is interesting and intends to find out everything about them. She asked about the spring, about the snares, about Bruno, whom she approached with such complete fearlessness that Bruno, who had been systematically suspicious of every new person who'd come through the entrance, simply accepted her and thereafter let her use him as a pillow when she sat on the ground. Other children followed Clara's lead the way children do. By the 5th day, there was a small rotating group of them who gathered near Mara in the mornings when she was managing the water and the fires, asking questions that ranged from practical to surreal. How do you know which plants are safe? What do you do if you see a wolf? Is the water magic? Why is the mountain warm? Why does the dog have a crooked ear? She answered all of them as plainly as she could, because she'd never seen the point of talking down to children, and because their parents were watching, and because the parents of children being patiently and competently taught something real, while everyone waited out a killer storm were people who were experiencing something that was slowly reshaping. How they thought about the woman doing the teaching. This was not a strategy. She wasn't calculating it. She was just answering the children's questions. The same way she'd moved the wet clothes off, Clara, or corrected the fire positions, or told Crowell the pot needed rotating. She was just doing what was in front of her. But things shift anyway, strategy or not, when people watch someone work. On the 7th day, a woman named Delia Ferris, whose husband had been one of the men most vocal in Coldwater Ridge about Thomas's debts and the embarrassment of the unpaid obligations, and who had consequently not looked Mara in the eye since October came to her in the evening and sat beside her without being asked. "I need to tell you something," Delia said. Mara waited. "When you walked out of town," Delia said. Her voice was controlled, but she was working to keep it that way. "I saw you from my kitchen window. I thought about going out." She stopped. Started again. "I didn't." Mara said nothing. "I don't have a good reason," Delia said. "I've been trying to think of one for 11 days, and I don't have one." The fire crackled between them. Bruno was asleep on the other side of it, his feet running slowly in some dream chase. "I know," Mara said. "That's usually how it goes." Delia looked at her, and whatever she'd expected Mara to say, that apparently wasn't it, because her carefully maintained composure cracked, and she put her face in her hands for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm very sorry." Mara looked at the fire. She thought about October, the full weight of that morning, the notice on the door and the faces behind the windows and the long walk with the blanket and the beans. She thought about what it would mean to carry that, not as a wound, but as a fact. Something that had happened that was part of the shape of things now. "I know you are," she said, and she meant it, which surprised her a little. The storm broke on the 11th day. The quality of the cold changed in the way it does when the worst of a system has passed, still brutal, but purposeful.
Now,
Rather than assaultive, the cold of actual winter, rather than the cold of something trying to kill everyone. People began preparing to leave. The organizational reverse of the arrival, gathering the things they'd brought, checking on each other, reassembling the shapes of their individual lives, after 11 days of living communally on a stone floor. It was not a quick process. People who have shared a difficult experience develop a particular reluctance to separate from each other. Not from affection necessarily, but from the windows were dark, but from the recognition that being together had been what kept them alive, and separation is therefore a small confrontation with the thing that had threatened them. Mara moved through all of it, helping where she could, checking that no one left underprepared, making sure the sick had been stable long enough to handle the journey down. Clara Morrison found her near the entrance as the last groups were preparing to go through. "Will you come to town?" she asked. Mara looked at her, this small, serious, entirely recovered child, who had turned gray in her mother's arms 8 days ago, and was now perfectly fine and asking perfectly reasonable questions. "Not right away," she said. "Will you come later?" "Maybe." Clara considered this. She looked at Bruno. She looked at the cavern behind them, the spring, the fires, the high dark ceiling she'd spent 11 days examining. "I like it here," she said. "It's warm." "It is. You should keep it." "I intend to," Mara said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to her mother. Voss was the last to leave, which she thought was deliberate. He came to her at the entrance with his hat in his hands. Again she noticed he always held his hat when he was about to say something that mattered to him, and he stood there for a moment looking at her with the complicated expression she'd come to associate with him. "The land claim," he said. "When spring comes, you have my word." "I remember." He stopped. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Just do it." He put his hat on. He ducked through the entrance. He was gone. And then the cavern was quiet. The fires she'd maintained through 11 days. And 44 people were lower now, wanting attention. The spring moved in the silence, steady and dark and warm, as it had always moved before she came, during all of it, and now after. Bruno lay near the water's edge with his chin on his paws, watching her with his quiet, complete attention. Mara stood in the middle of the cavern that had been, for 11 days, the only reason 44 people were still alive. She stood there and let the silence come back in, and she noticed that it felt different than it had before they came. The same geological quiet, the same stone and water and heat. But the cavern had held something now, a memory, if a place can be said to have one. The sound of children, the smell of many fires, Delia Ferris's wet eyes in the firelight. She sat down by the spring and put her hand in the warm water and let her eyes close. The mountain was hers. The winter wasn't over. But the worst of it for the town, for the children, for herself had passed through this place, and out the other side, and they were all still here. That was enough for tonight. That was more than enough. Quiet lasted 3 days. Not peaceful quiet, the mountain was never entirely peaceful, not in deep winter, with the ice shifting in the rock above and the wind working at the exterior like something that hadn't given up yet. But it was the quiet of one person and one dog, which was a quality of quiet Mara knew intimately by now, and after 11 days of 44 people in the same stone space, it felt enormous. Like the cavern had doubled in size by emptying out. She used the 3 days well. She had to the 11 days of the evacuation had cost her in ways she was only now able to assess. The food stores she'd so carefully managed through the autumn were significantly reduced. The wood she'd stockpiled near the entrance was down to less than half. The organization of the cavern itself, the sleeping ledges, the fire positions, the water management system had been partially dismantled by the weight of 44 people making 44 individual decisions about where to put things and needed to be rebuilt. She rebuilt it, methodically, without rushing, because she'd learned in the first weeks here that rushing in a mountain was how you made errors, and errors when you were alone had no one to catch them. But she noticed something different in herself during those 3 days, something she hadn't felt in the first months of solitude. The succulence that had once felt like a material she could work with, solid, manageable, now felt thinner in places. Not unbearable, but present in a different way, the way a room feels different after people have been in it and left. The cavern remembered the 11 days the way it holds the faint residue of what it has contained. She found herself talking to Bruno more than usual. He received this with his characteristic patience, ears moving to track the sound of her voice, eyes following her around the space, offering the particular comfort of a creature that is entirely present without requiring anything of you. On the third evening, she sat by the spring and did what she'd been avoiding doing since the evacuation ended, which was think clearly about what came next. Not the immediate next wood, food, water, the ongoing arithmetic of survival. The larger next, spring, the land claim. Whatever form her life was going to take when the world thawed out, and she had to make decisions that weren't purely about staying alive. She didn't have clean answers. She hadn't expected clean answers. But she held the questions in the warm air of the cavern and let them sit, which was a different relationship with uncertainty than she'd had before October. Before October, she'd needed things resolved. Now she could wait. Not contentedly, not peacefully. She wasn't built for contentment and had stopped pretending otherwise, but patiently. There was a distinction. On the 4th day after the evacuation, Gideon came back. He came with a pack that clinked and bumped in a way that wasn't his trapping equipment, and when he came through the entrance and set it down, she could see it was food. Not luxurious food-dried salt pork, hardtack, a cloth bag of cornmeal, 2 jars of preserved vegetables that had the look of someone's carefully maintained winter stores. He set them out on the flat ledge near the fire, without ceremony. From town, he said. Mara looked at the food, then at him. Whose? Multiple. Ruth Morrison sent the vegetables. Aldrich sent the cornmeal. He paused. Hector Pruitt sent the salt pork and said, "Tell you so seriously, it's not more." Quiet for a moment. Old Hector, who'd watched her walk out of town with his broom in his hands and said, "Winter's coming fast," and gone back to sweeping. Sending salt pork through the mountains. There was something in that, not redemption exactly, not apology, but something in the neighborhood of both, expressed in the language of practical people who don't know how to say the thing directly, and so say it sideways, through food, through showing up. "And you?" she asked. "What's yours?" Gideon reached into his coat and produced a paper-wrap package she hadn't noticed. He set it on the ledge with the rest. "Tobacco," he said. "For the pipe. In case you had one." She had Thomas's pipe, which she'd taken without thinking about why, packed in with the wool blanket and the photograph. She hadn't smoked it, but she'd kept it. "I have one," she said. He nodded. He looked around the cavern cleaner now, reorganized, the fires back where she needed them, put it back together. Had to. "You sleep?" Some pulled at sass, coat off, and sat down on the ledge in the manner of a man who has decided he's staying for a while without making an announcement about it. Bruno immediately relocated from his spot near the spring to a position closer to Gideon's feet, which had become their established arrangement during the evacuation days, when Gideon's hands had been consistently warm and often carrying food. "Tell me about the other settlements," Mara said. She'd been thinking about this. Voss had mentioned to Stott, in passing, during the evacuation, that other communities in the region were facing the same winter, and the image of it had stayed with her. How bad? Gideon's face shifted in a way she'd learned to read as him deciding how much to say. Bad, he said finally. The Millhaven camp, about 12 miles east, lost 4 people in January. 2 elderly, 2 young children. The camp at Redtail Crossing got cut off completely from the supply route in November, and we haven't had word since. He paused. Coldwater Ridge lost no one. That's not typical. That's the 11 days, she said. That's the 11 days, he agreed. She let that sit. It had weight to it, the specific weight of people who are alive because something happened that might not have happened. 4 people dead in Millhaven. Unknown losses at Redtail Crossing. Coldwater Ridge, none. The difference was a geological accident and a dog with a bent ear and a woman who'd been too stubborn to lie down in the snow. She didn't feel good about it exactly. It was too large for feeling good about. It was just a fact, the kind that settles into you differently, depending on the hour you consider it. Voss has been talking, Gideon said. About the land claim. About spring. What kind of talking? The good kind, mostly. Council meeting last week. 3 members, the ones who matter, came out clearly that the cavern and the surrounding acreage should be filed in your name. He looked at her. Crowell wasn't in the meeting. Was he invited? Technically. She almost smiled. What does technically mean? It means the notice was sent to his office at a time when everyone knew he'd be managing the bank's own winter problems and unlikely to attend. Gideon's expression was neutral. The timing wasn't calculated. Probably, she said. He reached into his pack again and pulled out something she hadn't seen coming, a folded piece of paper, official looking, with a wax seal she didn't immediately recognize. He held it out. She took it, unfolded it. It was a preliminary land claim filing. Her name was on it. The acreage described was the mountain section, including the cavern and the surrounding terrain, bounded by survey markers she recognized from the descriptions she'd given Voss about the geography. At the bottom was Voss's signature and 2 council member signatures and a date, February 14th, 1889, Valentine's Day. She had no idea if that was intentional or not. It probably wasn't, but it was the kind of detail that stuck. It's not final, Gideon said. Spring filing makes it legal, but it's the intention in writing with signatures. She held the paper in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Mara. She looked up. You all right? She thought about October. The notice on the door, the language of that document, outstanding encumbrance, right of possession transferred the way legal language made the taking of things sound like nothing. Now, different legal language, different names, different meaning. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. I'm all right. She folded the paper carefully and put it inside the cloth that held Thomas's photograph in the flat interior pocket of her coat that was closest to her body. February gave way to March, the way seasons change, at altitude, not gradually, but in arguments. Warm days that felt like promises, followed by cold snaps that made clear the promises were conditional. Mara had learned to read the mountain's version of these changes, which were more subtle than the dramatic shifts visible from the valley. A particular quality of meltwater in the stream she'd found in January. The way Bruno pressed against the cavern entrance in the mornings, sniffing the outside air with a different kind of attention, less defensive, more curious. She began making longer trips outside. Not just to the snares, but further, relearning the terrain in its winter into spring transition, which was a different landscape than the one she'd arrived in. The snow was still deep, but had a different character, wetter, heavier, less hostile. She found a south-facing slope she hadn't explored before, and on a late February afternoon she stood on that slope in weak sunshine and felt it on her face for the first time in 4 months, and stood very still because she didn't want to move and lose it. Bruno sat beside her and turned his face up too. It was on one of these longer trips, on the first day of March, that she came across the thing she hadn't been expecting. She'd gone further east than usual, following a game trail that had revealed itself under the receding snow, and she came over a ridge and looked down into a hollow and saw smoke. Not the smoke of a fire someone had built too thin, too unsteady, but the smoke of a fire someone was trying to maintain with not enough fuel. There was a lean-to in the hollow, half collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and beside it a figure in clothing too light for the conditions, moving with the deliberate, effortful slowness of someone who is cold to the core and has been for a while. She didn't think about it. She went down. The figure heard her coming and turned, and it was a boy maybe 16, maybe younger, with dark eyes wide with alarm, and a face that was both too thin and too old for his age, the way faces get when someone has been hungry for a long time. He backed up against the lean-to. "I'm not going to hurt you," Mara said. She stopped moving. "I've got a warm place about a mile back. I've got food and a fire, and it's better than what you've got here. You can come or not." He stared at her. Bruno sat down in the snow, which was his way of saying, "I am completely non-threatening. Observe how still I am." "Is that your dog?" the boy asked. "Yes." He looked at Bruno for a long moment. Then he looked at the lean-to, which was obviously losing the battle with physics, and at his hands, which had the mottled look of someone who'd been cold too long. He looked back at her. "All right," he said. His name was Eli. He was 15, from a logging camp north of Redtail, crossing the camp that had gone silent since November that Gideon had mentioned. He'd been separated from the camp during a scouting run in December, and had been surviving alone for 2.5 months in the mountains, which was an extraordinary thing for a 15-year-old to have done, and which he described with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone who'd had no one to tell the story to and had therefore stopped thinking about it as a story. He sat in the cavern with his hands wrapped around a tin cup and ate the cornmeal porridge she made him and didn't speak much, and Bruno lay against his leg with the calm certainty of a dog who has made a decision. She let him sleep for most of the first day. He slept the way she had on her first night, not choosing it, simply going under, his body reclaiming what it needed. When he woke, she asked him about the camp. He told her what he could, which wasn't much. He'd been 15 miles out when the weather closed in, had tried to navigate back, had failed, had started surviving. He didn't know what had happened at Redtail Crossings and no. She watched his face when she told him that the other settlement had gone quiet, and she saw him process it in the careful way of a young person trying to hold something large. "My father was at the camp," he said. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance she didn't have. "When the spring comes and the trails open, we'll find out," she said. "Until then, you're here." He nodded. He looked around the cavern. "You live here alone until recently. How long?" "Since October." He thought about this. "That's a long time." "It is." He looked at the spring. "I'd read about these. Geothermal springs." He said the word carefully, like he'd encountered it in a book, and wasn't entirely sure how it sounded out loud. "The heat comes from underground, from where the rock is still." He stopped, searching. "Still warm," she said. "Still warm from when everything was made," he said. She looked at him. 15 years old, 2.5 months alone in a mountain, and he wanted to talk about geology. She found this unexpectedly moving in the way that small things sometimes are when you've been living close to the essentials for long enough. "That's right," she said. "Exactly right." Gideon came back in the second week of March with more food and different news. He came through the entrance and saw Eli, who was at the far end of the cavern, checking the water level in the boiling pots with the focused competence he'd developed rapidly over 10 days of being given tasks, and stopped moving. "Who's that?" he said quietly. "Eli. From the Redtail Crossing camp." Mara kept her voice even. "Found him on the south slope, beginning of March." Gideon looked at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You went out past the ridge." "I did, by yourself." "I do most things by myself." She met his gaze. "What's the news?" He brought it out in pieces, the way you do when some of it is good and some of it isn't, and you're deciding on the order. The supply train was expected to run again within 3 weeks, the pass being cleared as fast as the crews could manage. The council's land filing had been formally submitted to the county registrar in the nearest city, carried by a man Voss had sent specifically for the purpose before the last window of weather. The good Clara Morrison had told every person in Coldwater Ridge about the mountain and the warm water and the woman with the dog, with the exhaustive detail of a 6-year-old decided something is important and intends to ensure everyone knows about it. The not good Crowell had sent a letter to the county registrar. Mara felt something tighten in her chest, contesting the claim. Not exactly. Gideon reached into his coat and produced a folded letter, his own copy, obtained through means he didn't immediately explain. "He's not contesting your claim to the cavern acreage. He's claiming that the hot spring itself, the water constitutes a mineral resource and falls under a different land classification that would require separate application and might be administered as a creditor of the original. That's not real, Mara said. That's not a real legal distinction. Probably not. But it's the kind of thing that requires a lawyer to establish it's not real. And lawyers cost money. And the county registrar might sit on the whole filing while the question is being resolved, which he stopped, could drag out past spring. She finished it, past when I need it settled. Yes. She stood very still for a moment. She was aware of Eli at the far end of the cavern, pretending not to listen in the obvious way of young people who are trying to be invisible and haven't quite learned how. He couldn't take the cavern, she said slowly, working it through. Voss's signatures, the council, the community, too much weight behind my claim for a direct challenge. So he's trying to take the spring. Without the spring, it's a cave. She felt the anger move through her, familiar and slow burning. That's what he's doing. Without the spring, it's just a hole in a mountain. Gideon was watching her carefully. He knows what the spring is worth, she said. Not to me, to the next person, to whoever buys it from him. Mineral rights, thermal water rights. A commercial venture, if the right kind of person came along with money. She looked at the spring, the dark, steady water that had kept her alive since October, that had kept 44 people alive through the worst 11 days of the winter. He lost the cavern, so he's trying to take the thing that makes the cavern matter. Yes, Gideon said. They were both quiet. From the far end of the cavern, Eli had given up pretending he wasn't listening. What do we do? Eli asked. Mara looked at him. He'd said we without hesitation, which she noted. We need someone who understands land law, she said. County law, specifically. The kind of person who knows whether Crowell's distinction is real or constructed. She thought, there's a man in Coldwater Ridge, Warren, the one who manages the mill contracts. He's not a lawyer, but he's read more law than most lawyers in this part of the country. Voss mentioned him. I know Warren, Gideon said. He's not cheap. What does he cost? Gideon told her. It was more than she had. It was significantly more than she had. She thought about the salt pork from Hector Pruitt, the cornmeal from Aldrich, Ruth Morrison's preserved vegetables, paper-wrapped tobacco. Voss needs to know about this letter, she said. Today, if possible. The people who sent food, they need to know what Crowell is trying. She looked at Gideon. Can you get back to town by dark? If I leave now, then leave now. He was already pulling his coat back on. Gideon. He turned. Tell Voss I need Warren here within the week. I'll explain why when Warren arrives, and tell Voss. She paused. Tell him the spring is what kept his town alive. And Crowell knows that, and if the town wants to keep being the kind of town that has someone to call on when things get bad, they need to be the kind of town that shows up when it matters. Gideon held her gaze for a beat. You want me to tell him that word for word? Yes, he almost smiled. All right, he turned to Eli. Keep the water rotating, kid. Eli straightened slightly. I know, he said with the particular dignity of a 15-year-old being taken seriously. Gideon went through the entrance and was gone. Warren arrived on the 5th day, which was faster than Mara had expected, and told her something about how Voss had framed the urgency. He was a compact, deliberate man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the habit of reading whatever was in front of him twice before responding, which Mara found immediately reassuring. He read Crowell's letter twice. He read the preliminary filing twice. He walked to the spring and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Thermal's mineral spring, he said finally. Yes. He's claiming it falls under the Mineral Resources Act of 1882. He tapped the letter, which it doesn't. Not clearly, the act was written for extractive mining resources. A thermal spring that produces heat rather than a mineable substance is an illegal gray area at best, but the weight of precedent in this state leans toward surface water rights, not mineral extraction law. He looked up, which means it follows the land, not a separate mineral claim. Meaning if I own the land, meaning if you own the land, you own the spring. Mara let out a breath she'd been holding. It felt, since Gideon had produced the letter. However, Warren said, and she felt the breath start to go back in, the county registrar is a cautious man. Crowell's letter is cleverly written. It raises enough technical ambiguity that a cautious registrar might pause the filing pending clarification, which could take months. What stops that? Warren set both documents on the ledge and put his hands together. Counterfiling. Detailed, citing the relevant case precedent, signed by someone the registrar respects, submitted before the registrar acts on Crowell's letter. He looked at her. Ideally within 2 weeks. Can you write it? I can write most of it. He paused. A co-signature from someone with standing would strengthen it considerably. Voss. Better than Voss. Voss is political, the registrar will see that. Someone with legal or professional standing. He paused again, and she could see him considering whether to say the next thing. There's a circuit judge who passes through the county in late March. Judge Alderman, I've worked with him. He has a reputation for pragmatism over technicality, and he has standing the registrar can't ignore. Warren looked at her steadily. He'd need to hear the case directly. Come here, see the spring, understand what it is, and what was done here. A judge. Judges are people, Warren said. Sometimes they respond to things that aren't purely legal. Thought about 44 people on a stone floor. She thought about Clara Morrison's gray lips and Ruth's shaking hands, and Delia Ferris in the firelight saying, I don't have a good reason. Thought of its windows were dark. She thought about what a judge would see stood where Warren was standing and understood what had happened in this space between October and March. Bring him, she said. Warren nodded. He reached into his bag and produced a writing kit, ink, paper, pen, and set himself up on the flat ledge without further discussion and began writing in the neat, careful hand of a man who has long understood that precise language is a form of precision instrument. Eli brought him hot water without being asked. The week before Judge Alderman arrived was the strangest of the entire winter, which was saying something. Coldwater Ridge, it turned out, had decided to have an opinion about Crowell's letter. This opinion was not favorable. The information had traveled through town with the same velocity as Gideon's original account, one person to the next, accumulating weight, and what it accumulated this time was something Mara could only call indignation. Not righteous indignation, not the clean kind, more the complicated, a slightly slightly self-conscious anger of people who are aware they didn't behave well earlier and are finding in Crowell's latest maneuver a more comfortable outlet with the feelings that have been building since October. She heard about it from Gideon, who came back 2 days after Warren's arrival with more food and a report that bordered on comic. Hector Pruitt, Gideon said, with the flat delivery he used when something was genuinely remarkable, apparently walked into the bank and asked Crowell to his face whether the letter about the mineral rights was his doing. What did Crowell say? That it was a matter of legal process and not Pruitt's concern. What did Hector say? He said. Gideon paused. He said that a man who needed to be rescued from a mountain by the woman he'd evicted credit in October had maybe used up his credit in this town, and that if he kept pulling on threads, he might not like what came loose. Mara stared at him. Hector Pruitt said that. Word for word. He told at least 4 people afterward. Gideon almost smiled. I think he's been saving it up. She tried to imagine the old liveryman, the broom, the pipe smoke, winter's coming fast, delivering that sentence to Silas Crowell in his warm office. She couldn't entirely picture it, but she believed it. What did Crowell do? Nothing yet. But Gideon's expression shifted. He's been making noises about leaving. His brother has interests in a city to the east. The word is he's been writing letters. She absorbed this carefully, the way she'd learned to absorb information that had implications she couldn't fully map yet. Crowell leaving. Crowell deciding that Coldwater Ridge, which had been a vehicle for his particular form of power, had become something else, a place where that power had been publicly weighed, and found to not be the thing that mattered most when it mattered most. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She found she didn't actually feel much about it at all, which surprised her. She'd carried anger toward Crowell for 5 months, the slow-burning specific kind, and now that his position was collapsing, she expected the anger to transform into something satisfying and found instead a kind of flat neutrality. He was just a man who had done what men like him did, and the world had disagreed with him, and now he was probably going to go somewhere else and do the same things to other people. That was not satisfying. That was just how it went. The filing, she said. Warren's counter document. Where does it stand? Voss signed it this morning. 3 council members signed it. Aldrich signed it. And Gideon reached into his coat for the 3rd time in as many visits, producing a folded set of papers. Ruth Morrison wrote a statement about what happened here in January. 11 days. He held it out. She asked me to bring it specifically. She said she wanted you to read it before the judge did. Mara took the papers and unfolded them. Ruth Morrison's handwriting was small and precise, and her statement was 3 pages long, which was longer than Mara would have expected from a woman who had mostly communicated in brief, direct sentences in the mountain. She read it slowly, standing by the spring, and what she found in it was not the account of events she'd expected, the facts of the evacuation. The logistics, the measurable outcomes. Ruth had written those things, but they were not what the document was about. What it was about was Clara. Ruth had written about her daughter in the particular way of a parent who has come very close to losing someone irreplaceable and has not stopped thinking about the exact details of that proximity. She described Clara's color when they arrived. She described the cavern air, the warmth of it, the contrast with what they'd left. She described watching a stranger remove her daughter's wet clothes with efficient, certain hands and make decisions for Clara's benefit without hesitation or consultation, simply because the decisions needed to be made. I did not know Mara Ellsworth before that night. Ruth had written, and I am ashamed that I did not, because she had been my neighbor for 3 years, and I had made no particular effort to know her. I watched her walk out of this town in October, and I did nothing, as most of us did nothing. My daughter is alive because of where that woman went after we let her go. I cannot improve on that fact with language, so I will simply state it plainly and ask that those reading this document allow its plainness to mean what it means. Mara stopped reading. She stood by the spring for a long moment. Then she folded the pages carefully and held them in both hands and breathed slowly and made herself stay with what she was feeling rather than push it aside and call it a distraction. It was grief, partly for October, for Thomas, for the version of this winter that hadn't happened, the one where none of it had been necessary. And it was something else that sat alongside the grief without canceling it, something warmer, less clean, harder to name. A particular feeling of being seen accurately by someone who had no particular reason to look. Eli was watching her from the far end of the cavern. He'd learned over the weeks to read the quality of her silences. "You okay?" he asked. She looked up. "Come here. I want you to read something." He crossed the cavern and she handed him Ruth's statement, and she watched his face while he read it, 15 years old, eyes moving carefully through the small, precise handwriting, the expression of someone encountering something that confirms a thing they've been working out on their own. He handed it back when he was done. "She got it right," he said simply. Judge Alderman arrived on March 22nd, 1 week before the snow on the pass would be manageable enough for regular travel. And just as the first real signs of spring were appearing on the south-facing slopes, a thinning in the snow's crust, particular quality of afternoon light that had ambition in it. He was older than Mara had expected, with a hearing aid in his left ear and the slow, considered movement of a man who has made a practice of not being rushed, and he came alone except for a clerk who carried the official documents and looked like he'd rather be anywhere warmer. Warren met them below the mountain and brought them up. The judge came through the cavern entrance and straightened up and stood still for a long time. He looked at the space, the size of it, the fires, the spring. He looked at Eli, who was managing the water pots with the practiced authority of someone who has been doing a job for a while. He looked at Bruno, who looked back with equanimity. Then he looked at Mara. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. "Judge." He walked slowly and carefully to the edge of the spring and stood looking at the water. "How hot?" he asked. "Enough to keep the air in here roughly 30 degrees warmer than outside, even in the worst of the winter. Enough to maintain a safe water temperature for bathing and, once boiled, for drinking." She paused. "Enough to keep 44 people alive for 11 days when their homes weren't keeping them alive anymore." He looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading situations, not just the facts of them, but the human shape underneath. "Tell me," he said simply. So she told him. She told it plainly, the way she'd decided to tell things since the mountain had taught her that plain was more durable than decorated. She started in October, at her door, with the notice and Crowell's palm flat on the wood. She told him about the walk out of town and the blizzard and the dog. She told him about 6 weeks alone and what she'd learned in them. She told him about Gideon and Voss's visits and the decision she'd made when she saw them coming through the storm in January. She told him about Clara Morrison's color when they arrived, and Ruth's shaking hands and Delia Ferris in the firelight. She told him about Crowell's letter about the mineral rights. He listened to all of it without interrupting. His clerk's pen moved steadily. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He walked back to the spring and looked at it again. He walked to the entrance and looked out at the mountain, at the slope leading down toward the distant shape of Coldwater Ridge. Then he turned back. Mr. Warren's counterfiling is thorough and legally sound, he said. The distinction Crowell is trying to draw doesn't hold under precedent in this state, and the registrar is going to see that clearly once it's in writing from someone with standing. He paused. I'll co-sign the document and send a letter to the registrar directly. The filing will proceed. Mara kept her face still. However, he held up one finger. I want to add a condition to my endorsement. Not a legal condition the legal claim stands as on its own, but a recommendation I intend to make formally in writing to the Coldwater Ridge Town Council and to the county records. What condition? She said. He looked around the cavern one more time, the spring, the high dark ceiling, the ledges, the organized, functional space that had been built by one woman over 4 months and had then held 44 lives. That this place not be treated as private property in the complete sense, he said. That it remains accessible formally in the land record as a refuge for any person in genuine need during dangerous conditions. He looked at her. Not a public building, not a government facility. Your land, your terms, your management, but with a formal designation as a sanctuary. He paused. I think that's what it already is. I'd like the record to say so. She looked at the spring. She thought about October, the notice, the walk, the mountain. She thought about Clara's gray lips. She thought about Clara's gray lips and Delia Ferris and what it had felt like to make the decision to open the door when she could have kept it closed. She thought about what she'd said to Voss. I'm not putting it in anyone's hands but mine. I set the terms, she said. You set the terms, the judge confirmed. And it stays in my name. Legally, fully, without condition. In your name. Fully, she was quiet for a long moment. Then yes. Put it in the record, he nodded once. Turned to his clerk. Draft the language tonight. I'll review it in the morning. The clerk nodded and began writing immediately. The way clerks do when they recognize that something significant has been said, and the job now is to catch it accurately before it moves. Mara stood in the center of the cavern, her mountain, her spring, and felt the warmth rising from the water the way it always had, steady and geological and indifferent to human drama, doing what it had always done because that was simply its nature. Outside, the light on the slope was doing something she hadn't seen since October. It was gold. Late afternoon, early spring gold, the specific color of a season that is not quite here yet, but is no longer pretending it isn't coming. Bruno pressed against her leg, and she put her hand on his head, and they both stood there, and the warmth came up from the stone beneath them, and the winter, the long, terrible, clarifying winter was almost done. The snow on the pass broke in the first week of April. Not all at once, that's not how mountains release winter. They do it reluctantly, in stages, the way someone lets go of something they've been holding for a long time. First, the south-facing slopes, where the afternoon light had been working quietly for weeks, turning the top layer of snow to a crust that softened by midday and refroze by night. Then the lower trails, where the runoff began cutting channels through the white. Then, finally, the pass itself still navigable only on foot, still requiring care, but open enough that a person could move through it without genuine risk of dying, which was the threshold that mattered. Mara knew the moment it happened not because she could see the pass from the cavern, but because Bruno told her. He'd been increasingly restless for 2 weeks, circling the entrance in the mornings, pushing his nose through the brush, and pulling it back with the particular dissatisfied energy of a creature who knows the season has changed and wants to be moving with it. On the morning the pass opened, he sat down at the entrance and looked at her with a clarity that was almost language. She went out. The air was different. Still cold April at elevation is not kind, but carrying something inside the cold that hadn't been there since October. A dampness, an alive quality, the smell of things beginning to happen underground before they happened above it. She stood on the slope outside the cavern entrance and breathed it in and felt something in her chest shift, like a door she hadn't known. Was closed, moving on its hinge. Eli came out behind her and stood beside her in the thin morning light. He'd been with her for 5 weeks by then, and in those 5 weeks, he'd become, she wasn't sure what the right word was. Not a son, she was only 10 years older. Not exactly a partner. Something specific to the situation, a collaboration between two people who had each survived the same mountain alone and understood each other on that basis without needing to explain it. He'd learned the cavern's systems completely. He checked the snares without being asked. He managed the water rotation with a precision that sometimes exceeded her own. He'd read Warren's legal counterfiling 3 times and asked questions about land law that Warren had answered with visible pleasure, the way a man answers questions when he's surprised by who's asking them. He hadn't heard from the Redtail Crossing camp that hung between them, unspoken most of the time, present always. Trail's open, he said. Getting there. He was quiet for a moment. I should go find out. I know. About my father. I know, Eli. He looked down the slope toward where the trail disappeared into the trees. He was 15 years old, and he'd spent the winter in a mountain, and he had a father somewhere at the end of a trail he hadn't been able to take for 5 months, and he was trying to hold all of that without letting it tip him over, which was a difficult thing to watch because she remembered what it was like to be young enough that you didn't yet know that difficult things could be survived without being resolved. You'll come back, she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her, yes. Whether or not. She stopped, started again. Whatever you find at Redtail Crossing, you come back. He understood what she was telling him, that the cavern was a place he could return to regardless of what awaited him at the end of that trail. That she wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going anywhere, that some things you built in the worst season of your life turned out to be more permanent than you'd intended them to be when you started. I'll come back, he said. He left the next morning with food and the knife she'd sharpened for him and directions to Redtail Crossing that Gideon had provided weeks ago in anticipation of this moment. Bruno walked with him to the tree line, and then came back to her, and she stood at the entrance and watched the trees until she couldn't see movement in them anymore. Then she went back inside and sat by the spring and felt the specific weight of a space that has been shared and is suddenly individual again, and she let herself feel it without trying to make it into something more manageable than it was. The legal document arrived on April 14th. Gideon brought it, making the climb with the unhurried competence of a man for whom the mountain trail had become ordinary, and he came through the entrance, with it held slightly apart from his body, the way people carry things that feel significant, and set it on the ledge in front of her without speaking. Picked it up. It was the finalized land deed. Her name, spelled correctly, in full. The acreage described precisely, matching the survey markers. The spring designated as surface water appurtenant to the land, following the land claim under established precedent, Cruel's mineral rights distinction, formally and permanently rejected. Judge Alderman's signature at the bottom, and below that the county registrar's seal, and below that the date, and below all of that, a secondary notation she read twice to make sure she was reading it accurately. Designated Community Refuge, Ellsworth Hearth. Access terms at proprietor's discretion. Designation recorded in county emergency records. Ellsworth Hearth. She hadn't named it. The designation had been the judge's language, drafted by his clerk, and it had arrived in the final document without her having confirmed it, which under other circumstances might have irritated her people, naming things that were hers without asking. But she read it again and found she didn't object. It was her name. It was hearth, which was the right word, not cave, not refuge in the utilitarian sense, but the word for the thing that a fire becomes when it's been burning long enough in one place that it turns into a center of gravity. She set the document down. It's done, Gideon said. It's done. He was watching her with the careful attention he'd developed over the winter, the look of a man who has seen someone go through something significant and learned not to project onto them what he imagines they should be feeling. How does it feel? She thought about the question honestly. Different than I expected. Good different, or not bad different. Just, she picked the document up again and looked at her name on it. Mara Ellsworth. I thought it would feel like the end of something. It feels more like the end of the beginning of something. Gideon nodded slowly. That's probably accurate. She looked up. What happened with Crowell? He'd been waiting for her to ask. She could tell. He settled himself on the ledge. He sold his interests in the bank last week. 2 buyers, 1 local, 1 from the city. The terms aren't public, but Hector Pruitt, who has ears everywhere, including places he shouldn't, Says Crowell got significantly less than market value because the buyers understood his position in the community had become. Gideon paused, choosing the word. Complicated, complicated. He's leaving Coldwater Ridge, possibly already gone, or going by the end of the month. He paused again. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. As far as I know, she absorbed this. The man who had put a notice on her door, with his palm flat on the wood, and said sundown leaving a town that remembered what his money had and hadn't done when the winter came for them. It was not a dramatic ending for him. It was the quiet, diminished kind, which was perhaps worse in its own way, not a confrontation, not a reckoning, just a gradual evacuation of relevance, until one morning you're not there anymore, and the space you left closes over quickly. She didn't feel what she might have felt about that in October. The anger had changed shape too many times over the winter to be what it had been. What she felt was something more like the mild, impersonal awareness of a thing concluded. The bank, she said, with new owners, will operate differently? Gideon shrugged. The new local buyer is Aldrich. He knows what happened here. He's not Crowell. He paused. That's probably the best that can be said. It's enough, she said, and meant it. Not every problem had a solution that was more than better than before, and she'd made peace with that somewhere in the long middle section of the winter. Spring came to the mountain the way it always comes, after a hard winter, not gently, not as a reward, but insistently, almost aggressively, as if the season had a lot of work to do and had fallen behind schedule. Snow pulled back from the south slopes first, and exposed ground that was soft and dark and smelled of everything that had been waiting under the ice for 5 months. Birds she hadn't heard since October reappeared, not gradually but all at once, as if they'd all agreed on the same morning to stop being quiet. Mara worked. That was what she did with spring. She worked, because the season demanded it, and because she had always been a person who understood herself best in motion, with a task in front of her that had measurable outcomes. She extended her exploration of the terrain around the cavern, mapping it in her head with the systematic attention she'd developed over the winter. She cataloged what grew where as it came up, what was edible, what was useful, what was neither. She built a better entrance structure for the cavern, reinforcing the brush cover with a more deliberate framework of branches that made the opening less obvious from a distance, but more accessible to someone who knew where to look. She thought during these working hours about the judge's designation, Ellsworth Hearth, a formal sanctuary, her terms, her management, her land, but a place that existed in the county's emergency records as somewhere a person could come in a genuine crisis. She thought about what that meant practically, not the legal meaning that was settled, the human meaning, what it meant to decide, in the place you'd built to survive with almost nothing, that the door would not be closed to people who arrived at it with almost nothing. It was not a simple decision, even with the document signed and the designation recorded. It was a decision she'd have to make again, continuously, over the years, because the designation was general and the reality was specific, and every specific case would be its own question. Qualified as genuine crisis, what she could offer, what she couldn't, where her capacity ended and obligation became something she couldn't meet. She didn't have clean answers to any of that. She thought she probably never would. That was the nature of the thing she'd committed to, not a policy but a practice. And practices require judgment. And judgment requires accepting that you will sometimes be wrong, and that being sometimes wrong is not a reason to close the door. She'd learned that from the winter too. The winter had been a long education in the difference between a principle and a practice, and in how much harder the practice was, and in how the hardness was actually the point of it. The people of Coldwater Ridge began coming up the mountain in the second week of April, not all at once, not in any organized way. They came in the manner of people who have made individual decisions to do a difficult thing and are arriving separately to avoid the social complexity of doing it together. Gideon came first, which didn't count because Gideon had been coming all winter. But he came this time with something in addition to food. He came with timber. 2 planks of good lumber, carried up on his back with the equanimity of a man who considers that a reasonable thing to do on a Tuesday. He set them down outside the entrance without explanation. "What are those for?" Mara asked. "Floor," he said. "The area just inside the entrance. Stone's rough there." Thought a wood section might. He stopped. Thought it would be more comfortable. For people who come. She looked at the planks. She looked at him. If you don't want it, I want it, she said. Thank you. He nodded. He got to work. Hector Pruitt came the next day alone, without the pipe he usually carried, which she interpreted as a form of respect, his version of removing a hat. He stood at the entrance and looked around, and then looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided to say the thing he came to say. I was wrong to just watch, he said, in October. You needed help, and I didn't give it. He held her gaze. I've thought about that a lot. She'd had months to think about how she'd receive this kind of thing when it came, and she still wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. The impulse was to minimize it was all right. You helped when it counted, but minimizing wasn't honest. What happened in October had been wrong, and minimizing it to make Hector feel better was its own form of disrespect, to him and to what she'd carried. I know you have, she said. I could tell from the salt pork. He almost smiled. Not quite. You helped when it counted, she said. That's real. And what happened before it, that's real too. Both things are true at the same time. She paused. I think that's probably how it's going to be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once. The same nod he'd given her in October outside the livery, but a different nod, heavier with understanding, the kind a man gives when he's come the end of something he's been working through. I brought tools, he said, for whatever you're building. Gideon's inside with planks. Hector looked faintly surprised. He beat me. He usually does. The old man picked up his bag and went through the entrance, and she heard him and Gideon exchange a brief greeting inside, and then the sound of two people working, which was a sound she hadn't heard in the cavern before the evacuation, and which now landed in her chest as something simple and good. Ruth Morrison came on a Saturday, with Clara and the two other children and her husband Daniel, who was a quiet man Mara had barely spoken to before the winter, but who had apparently spent the 11 evacuation days watching everything Mara did with an attention that had not been casual. He came in carrying a canvas pack that turned out to contain seeds, vegetable seeds, a careful selection, labeled in his neat handwriting. The South Slope, he said when he handed them to her. I looked at it on the way up. Protected from the north wind, good sun exposure after noon. If you're planning to put in a garden, I'm planning to, she said. Tomatoes will struggle at this elevation, he said, but beans do well. Root vegetables, some of the hardier greens. He paused. I used to farm before I came to Coldwater Ridge. I know what grows where. She looked at the seeds in her hands. She looked at Daniel Morrison, who had been nothing more than Ruth's quiet husband before the winter, and was now a man offering his knowledge in the language of seeds handed over on a mountainside. I'd be glad of your help figuring it out, she said. He nodded. He looked around the mountain with the assessing gaze she recognized, the same look she'd used on the cavern in her first days there, seeing potential rather than just present reality. You've got more workable land here than it might seem, he said. The ridge blocks the worst of the wind. The spring water, he paused. You could irrigate. If you knew what you were doing, teach me. He looked slightly startled, as if he'd been prepared for more reluctance. All right, he said. Where do you want to start? Clara, meanwhile, had already gone through the cavern entrance, and was presumably explaining to Bruno the many things that had happened in her life since she last saw him. The visits became regular. Not every day the mountain trail was still a commitment, not something you did casually but consistent enough that Mara began to know the sound of different people's footsteps on the slope. Gideon, brisk and even. Hector, deliberate, with a slight drag on the left foot she'd never noticed when she'd lived in town. Ruth, quick. Daniel, slow and specific, always stopping to look at something on the way up. They brought things, food, tools, materials. The blacksmith, a woman named Agnes Holt, who had been one of the faces Mara didn't recognize behind the windows in October, and who had apparently decided that her way of accounting for that was through ironwork, appeared one morning with a set of iron hooks and a small cast iron pot that was better than anything Mara currently owned, and installed the hooks in the cavern wall without asking permission, and left the pot without comment and went back down the mountain. Mara looked at the hooks and the pot for a long moment. Good hooks, Gideon observed, from where he was working on the floor planking. Good pot, she said. Agnes Holt makes the best ironwork in 3 counties. 2. He ran his hand along the plank. This is her apology. That's how she does them. Mara reached out and touched the nearest hook. Cold iron, smooth, set deep in the stone. Something that would last longer than the person who put it there. I'll use it well, she said. To no one in particular. To the hook, maybe. To the winter, maybe. To the version of herself that had crawled through frozen brush in a blizzard, with her hands going numb, and found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Eli came back on April 28th. She heard him on the slope from inside the cavern. Bruno heard him first, head coming up from the floor, with the particular attention he reserved for people he knew, and then she heard the footsteps, and something in the rhythm of them told her before she saw him. He came through the windows were dark. He came through the entrance and stood there, and Bruno went to him immediately and pressed against his leg, and Mara looked at his face and read what was in it. Your father, she said. He nodded. A single nod controlled, the kind you do when you're holding something large and don't have the capacity right now to also manage how you look while you hold it. She crossed the cavern and put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say she was sorry she was, but he knew that, and what he needed right now wasn't the acknowledgement of the loss. Sit down, she said. I'll make something hot. He sat. Bruno lay against his feet. She made the porridge with the last of Ruth Morrison's preserved vegetables stirred in, which made it better than straight cornmeal, and she gave it to him hot and sat across from him and didn't ask him to talk until he'd eaten all of it, and the color had come back into his face, which took longer than the eating did. The camp had a hard January, he said finally. 4 people didn't make it through. My father. He stopped. He set the cup down. He made it through January. He died in February. Fever. He looked at his hands. Camp didn't know how to find me. I didn't know how to find them. We were both. He stopped again. She waited. He knew I could survive, Eli said. That's what the camp leader told me. He said my father kept saying, Eli knows the mountains. Eli knows what to do. He wasn't. His voice held. He wasn't afraid for me. He was just waiting to see me again. The cavern was very quiet. Outside, the spring wind was working at the mountain with its soft insistence. Somewhere above them, meltwater was moving through rock. He was right, Mara said. You knew what to do. It didn't help him. No, she said. It didn't. That's a true thing. She looked at him directly. So is the other thing. Both of them are true. He looked up. You survived a winter alone in a mountain at 15 years old, she said. Your father knew that about you before you did. The fact that it didn't save him doesn't make it less true. She paused. You'll carry both things. That's what it is. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want to stay here. For a while, if you don't have to ask, she said. I might go back to the camp eventually. There are people there I knew. I should. She looked at him. This is here when you need it. That's what it is. Come and go as you need to. She paused. That's what I'm making it. He looked around the cavern, the new floor, planking near the entrance, the iron hooks on the wall, Agnes Holt's pot hanging above the fire, the spring moving in the dark behind them. He looked at it like someone seeing something for the first time that he's been looking at for a while without quite seeing it. Ellsworth hearth, he said. That's right. Who named it that? The judge's clerk. She paused. I kept it. He nodded slowly. He picked up the cup again and finished the last of the porridge, and Bruno shifted against his feet, and outside the wind moved through the spring trees with a sound that was nothing like the wind sounds of January lighter, less committed to anything, just moving through because movement was what wind did. The town council met in the 3rd week of April to make the decision formally, which Mara was not present for and did not need to be. Gideon was there, and Warren, and Voss, and several of the people who'd spent the 11 days in the cavern, and what they decided, which Gideon reported to her afterward, with the economical precision she'd come to rely on, was this. Community would maintain the trail to Ellsworth Hearth. They would do it collectively, rotating its responsibility, the same way they maintained the roads through town. The trail was access to a designated county refuge, and they would treat it accordingly, which meant in practical terms that Mara would not be doing that work alone, and the path to her mountain would remain passable as a matter of community commitment rather than her individual effort. They also voted 4-1 to establish a small fund contribution-based, voluntary, managed by Aldrich's Reformed Bank, specifically designated for maintaining supplies at Ellsworth Hearth. Dried goods, medical basics, lamp oil, things that a shelter should have available for anyone who needed it. One council member voted against, which Gideon reported without naming the member, and Mara didn't ask who. There was always one. That was not cynicism, it was just a true fact about groups of people making decisions, that unanimity was the exception and one holdout was ordinary, and the work went forward regardless. Voss wants to meet with you, Gideon said, about the formal arrangement, nothing adversarial administrative. What you'll need, what the town can reasonably provide, how the communications works if someone needs the hearth urgently. Tell him Thursday, if the weather holds. Gideon nodded. One more thing. He reached into his coat, the coat pocket that had produced so many significant pieces of paper over the winter that Mara had begun to think of it as some kind of documentary archive, and this time produced not paper but something small and solid. He set it on the ledge. It was a key. Iron, well-made, Agnes Holt's work visible in the clean lines of it. But there was no lock on the cavern, the entrance had no door, and she'd never intended one. What is that for, she said. Symbolic, Gideon said. He looked slightly abashed, which was not his usual expression. It was Hector's idea. He said, every home should have a key. Even if the door's always open. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Good iron, warm from his pocket. Every home should have a key. She sat with that for a moment, not the sentiment, the fact underneath it. That a man who'd watched her walk out of his town with a blanket and a bag of beans had spent the winter deciding that what she'd built in a mountain was a home, and had asked the best ironworker in 3 counties to make her a key for it. That was the shape of what had changed. Not a speech, not a ceremony. A key, an acknowledgement in iron. She put it in her pocket, next to the photograph of Thomas and the preliminary land filing she'd kept there since February. Thank you, she said. Tell Hector. Summer came. She hadn't let herself think much about summer during the winter. It had been too far away, too abstract, the kind of thing you could see only as a concept rather than a real condition. But summer came, and it was real, and it was different from anything she'd known in her 25 years because she was a different person inhabiting it. She built the garden with Daniel Morrison's and guidance on the south-facing slope he'd identified in April. It was not an easy garden. The elevation made everything slower, more precarious, more dependent on timing and attention than a valley garden would have been. She lost the first planting of beans to a late frost in May and replanted without a great deal of emotion about it, because the winter had calibrated her relationship to loss and replanting in a way that made a late frost feel manageable. She got the second planting right. By July, the beans were coming in. She built a cabin. Not alone, she had help, and she wasn't too proud to take it. Gideon and Daniel and 3 other men from Coldwater Ridge came up on 4 separate weekends through the summer, and she worked alongside them, and what went up was modest and functional and hers. One room, a loft, a porch that faced south and caught the afternoon sun. She positioned it so that the cavern entrance was visible from the porch, which was a choice she'd made deliberately. She wanted to be able to see the mountain from where she sat, wanted to see anyone coming up the trail before they arrived at the entrance. The porch became, without any particular intention, her favorite place. She'd sit there in the evenings with the pipe she'd started using, that spring Thomas's pipe, her tobacco now, the habit adopted with a clear-eyed acknowledgement that it was a way of keeping a connection she wasn't ready to fully let go of, and she'd watch the light on the mountain and think about things that didn't need to be resolved, which was a new relationship with thinking that the winter had given her. Bruno slept on the porch most nights. He was getting slower, not old, not yet, but no longer young in the effortless way of his first years with her. His bent ear still tracked sounds before her own hearing could find them. His eyes, when they found her, still had the same absolute quality of attention, the same total commitment to the project of being her dog that had been there from the beginning. She thought about Thomas differently in the summer than she had in the winter. In the winter, the grief had been present but compressed. She'd had too much to do to give it room, and it had lived in the space between tasks, in the specific loneliness of the evening hours. In the summer, with less existential urgency pressing on all sides, the grief spreads out into its full shape. She let it. She wasn't afraid of it. It was part of the fabric of the year, of this strange, terrible, clarifying year that had taken her from a doorstep in October to a porch in July and had remade her in the interval in ways she was still cataloging. She did not romanticize what had happened to her. She was clear-eyed about that, because romanticism was a kind of falsification, and she had no patience for it. She had not been sent to the mountain. She had been pushed. The difference mattered. The pushing had been wrong, and the fact that she'd built something remarkable in response to it did not make the pushing right, and she refused to construct a narrative in which Crowell's notice on her door was some necessary catalyst that she should be grateful for. She was not grateful for it. She had survived it and turned it into something which was different. What she believed what the winter had taught her, slowly, in the way mountains teach things, through repetition and consequence rather than revelation, was that the question of what you were capable of was only ever answered by what you actually did, and that most people, including herself, didn't know the answer until they were forced to find out. She hadn't known she could survive alone in a mountain. She hadn't known she could organize 44 people through an emergency in a space built for one. She hadn't known she had the specific capacity to open her door to the people who'd closed theirs to her. She'd found out. That was the winter's actual gift. Stripped of any sentiment, not the land, not the recognition, not even the community she'd partially rebuilt her relationship to. The knowledge of her own actual dimensions. What she was and wasn't. What she could carry. That knowledge belonged to her in a way nothing else did, in the way that only things you've earned through genuine difficulty can belong to you. Eli came back in September. He'd spent the summer between the hearth and the Red Tail Crossing camp, where he'd helped the remaining members rebuild and reorganize in the aftermath of the winter's losses. He arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday evening in the particular amber light of early fall and sat on the porch with her and Bruno and accepted a cup of coffee that she'd been able to afford since summer. When Gideon had brought it up, along with news, that the supply trains were running consistently again, he looked older. A different kind of older than he'd looked in April, not the compressed, careful bearing of someone managing grief, but the settled quality of a young person who has been given large things to carry and has found that they can carry them. The camp is stable, he said. 12 people. They'll make this winter. Good. I told them about the hearth. He paused. 3 of them might come, if December gets bad. I told them they could. She looked at him. You told them. He held her gaze steadily. I said I thought it would be all right to tell them. It is all right. She looked out at the mountain in the evening light. That's what it's there for. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I've been thinking about what you told me, in April, about carrying both things. What about it? I think it's right, he said. But I think it's also, he stopped, searching for the language. He was 15 and then 16 over the summer, and 16 had given him more vocabulary for the things he'd been thinking about at 15, but couldn't quite say. I think it's also true that you don't just carry them. After a while he stopped again. What? She said. You use them, he said, both of them. The hard things become what you know, and what you know is what you have to give. He looked at her. That's what happened to you, isn't it? She looked at him, this boy who had survived a mountain and lost his father, and come out the other side, still asking questions, still looking at things until he understood them. She thought about October, the notice, the walk. She thought about the cavern and the spring, and 6 weeks alone. She thought about Clara Morrison's gray lips and Delia Ferris's wet eyes, and a key that Hector Pruitt had commissioned because every home should have one. Yes, she said. That's what happened to me. He nodded. He looked satisfied in the way of a young person's, whose thinking has been confirmed by someone whose judgment they respect, which was its own form of something she didn't have a word for. They sat in the amber light until the light went, and the stars came out in the specific dense pattern visible only at altitude, where there's no town light to drown them. Bruno lay between their chairs with his feet running slowly in some eternal dream chase. The mountain was dark and present behind the cabin, enormous and indifferent, and somehow, inexplicably hers. The second winter came. It was nothing like the first, not gentler. Exactly, because the mountains were not gentle, but familiar. She knew its language. Now, she read, its signs. She had food stored correctly, wood stacked properly, the cabin insulated with the things she'd learned she'd needed and hadn't had the first time around. In December, The 3 people from Tell Crossing that Eli had mentioned arrived at the hearth. She brought them in, got them warm, fed them, assessed what they needed and what she could provide. They stayed 2 weeks and left stronger than they'd arrived. And one of them, a woman around Mara's age named Cora, careful eyes of someone who has learned not to trust easily, shook Mara's hand at the entrance when she left and held it a beat longer than a handshake required. "I'll tell people," Cora said, "what this is. Tell them to come if they need to." Cora nodded once and went down the mountain. A family from a failed homestead east of the pass came in January. 2 children, a husband and wife, who had the stunned quality of people whose plan has failed in the specific way that plans fail when you've built everything on them. Not just the practical plan, but the internal architecture, the version of yourself that the plan was supposed to make real. They stayed 5 weeks. They left in February when the weather opened, heading toward the town where the wife's sister lived, and on the day they left, the husband stood in the entrance and looked at Mara and said, "We had nothing when we found this place." "I know," she said. "How do you—" He stopped. He didn't finish. She thought about the answer. "You just keep the door open," she said. "That's the whole thing. Just keep the door open." He nodded, and his wife came and took his arm, and they went down the mountain with their children between them, and she watched them go until the trees took them, and then she turned back inside. The spring was doing what it always did, moving in the dark, steady and warm, older than anything else in the valley, indifferent to all of it, and also, in its geological way, responsible for all of it. Bruno looked up at her from his spot near the water. She sat down beside him on the stone floor and put her hand on his side and felt his breathing slow and even, the breathing of an old dog in a warm place. Outside, the second winter was doing its work. Inside, the hearth was doing its work too. Not perfect. Never perfect. There would be difficult decisions she'd make wrong. People she couldn't help enough. Winters she misjudged. Limits she'd hit and have to acknowledge. She'd built nothing clean, nothing finished, nothing that could be resolved in the way that stories sometimes let things resolve. The door was open. The spring was warm. The key Hector Pruitt had made hung on the iron hook Agnes Holt had put in the stone. Not because there was a lock to use it on, but because it meant what he'd said it meant. Every home should have a key. This was her home. A banker had once decided she didn't deserve one. The mountain had disagreed. And she had spent the hardest year of her life turning that disagreement into something that would outlast all of them, the banker, the blizzard, the hunger, the long silences, all of it. Not because she was extraordinary. She had never been extraordinary. She was a 25-year-old woman who knew how to work and refused to stop working and had a dog with a bent ear who found the right hole in the right rock face on the right terrible night. But she had done what was in front of her, and then the next thing, and then the next. And that, it turned out, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The fire held. The water moved. The mountain kept its lungs were dark. The mountain kept its long, patient warmth and sat on the floor of the home that no one could take from her and let the winter do what winters do, while the hearth did what it had always been made to do. It held.